Order, Mr. Speaker.
Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continued help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask for extended leave for an introduction.
Premier has requested leave. Leave is granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues for granting leave to you and through you to all members of this Assembly and to all people of the province, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today Saskatchewan's 13th Premier, Lorne Calvert, accompanied by his wife, Betty. Here, here, here. Mr. Speaker, just a couple of words on former Premier Calvert's time as an elected member, but more to the point, his time as a Premier and some of the accomplishments that he had really achieved on behalf of Saskatchewan people. And I'd point to one that is more on the national stage. Mr. Speaker, Premier Calvert was among a number of premiers across the nation. Danny Williams, I believe Ralph Klein might have been in there, Mr. Speaker. We had Gordon Campbell, we had Gary Doer, Jean Charest, really well-known national names that came together to form the Council of Federation, I believe in 2003, if I'm not mistaken. Former Premier Calvert from Saskatchewan was among that esteemed group, Mr. Speaker, to form that entity that really lent a stronger voice to the provinces and the territories in this nation. Mr. Speaker, they very quickly were able to negotiate a health accord with, I think at the time it was the Martin government, Mr. Speaker, and really benefit all Canadians on behalf of the people that we collectively represent in this chamber and collectively represent as premiers across the nation. Former Premier Calvert, I think back to 2019 when we had hosted the most recent Council of Federation meetings here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan on the riverbank there. He wrote a piece in the CBC with respect to, at that time, Mr. Speaker, I was chairing the Council of Federation with respect to how to manage and really paying attention to managing the personalities around the table. And when I looked back and read through some of the names that Premier Calvert had worked with some of his colleagues, Danny Williams, for example, Ralph Klein, Gary Doer, you know, some very strong personalities around the table in that day. And when you look around the table today, also a number of strong personalities from varying political stripes, Mr. Speaker, that come together to collectively really advocate and to represent people in this nation. And I appreciated that guidance very much during that week when we had a number of premiers here in Saskatoon, Mr. Speaker. And I would just say thank you to Premier Calvert and his colleagues of the day for bringing that Council of Federation together. It's alive and active and well today. I think post that meeting in Saskatoon, we ran into the COVID situation where our tenure as chairing, and so the province of Saskatchewan's tenure of chairing the Council of Federation was extended 5 or 6 months as we started convening not one Council of Federation meeting a year, but started convening them on the telephone weekly. Then it went to bi-weekly, but most certainly we convened, I think, by the end of that year, 40 or 50 Council of Federation meetings as we found our way through COVID-19, used that Council of Federation table to work with the federal government to bring supports to Saskatchewan people, yes, but to all Canadians. And I believe the federal government had brought forward I think it was a Safe Restart Fund, which was a little over $20 billion in one-time funding to support Canadians. And that happened through negotiations from the Council of Federation table that then progressed to a First Minister's table. And so I thank Premier Calvert for his role in bringing and forming that very important table in this nation, Mr. Speaker. I would just close with this. In addition to that effort, I want to thank Premier Calvert for, firstly, the example that he sets as a citizen in his community and in his province. As we know, former Premier Calvert and Betty are people of faith, and they display that each and every day. And I want to thank them for the very solid display that they put forward each and every day, not only in the community where they live, but across this province. I want to thank, again, both former Premier Lauren Calvert and Betty for the time that they served in this Assembly and the time that they served the people of the province, not just as Premier, but as MLA and as Minister. And as we know, no one serves in this Assembly alone. You serve in this Assembly with the support of your family, and that most certainly, I think, was the case during Lauren's time in this Assembly, Mr. Speaker, with Betty by his side, supportive the entire way. And last but not least, I want to thank Saskatchewan's 13th Premier for his service as Premier. Today is a good day, Mr. Speaker, and I have more to say about that in a ministerial statement, but it's a day most certainly that we all on this floor honor, Lauren, you for your service in this Assembly, honor you for your service as Premier of this province, and thank you, Betty, for supporting him every step of the way. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan's 13th Premier, Lauren Calvert, and his wife, Betty.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask leave for an extended introduction as well.
Leave has been requested. Is leave granted? Carried.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join the Premier and all the members present in welcoming Mr. Calvert and Betty to their legislature and thanking them for all of their contributions to our province, and they are so many. And today, as we recognize Mr. Calvert with a naming of something pretty special, and we'll talk more about that in response to the Premier's ministerial statement later today. We'll talk a little bit more about his legacy and why that honour is particularly important, but this is a man who's received a number of honours. He's a member of the Saskatchewan Order of Merit. He is recently awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award from his alma mater at the University of Regina. He'll have something named for him today, but I feel like the naming of Maxwell Lorne Martinello a few weeks ago might be the thing he's most proud of bearing his name. His latest grandson, third grandson to him and Betty. I know they're very proud of Steph and proud of all of their family, of Haven and Levi, their grandsons. Betty, it's great to see you in your legislature. Betty, as folks know, is originally from Purdue. Figure skater and skating coach, was a leader with the Meewasin Valley Authority, and is a very talented photographer, as well as having had a very active career as top advisor to the Premier of Saskatchewan. And of course, Mr. Calvert, originally from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, studied at the U of R, got his degree in economics, which would serve him well and serve the province well. He then went on to become a United Church minister, serving in small communities around the province, including a stint as the minister at Kildare, where I went to school. And of course, he was elected in 1986, joining then former Premier Blakeney as part of opposition and returning New Democrats to government alongside Roy Romanow in 1991, serving as a minister in that government that did so much to recover the finances and well-being of Saskatchewan people. And then in 2001, he became our 13th Premier. We'll talk more about the legacy and the work that he did in that role later this afternoon. But I think it's worth noting, this is someone who has been, as the Premier said, a leader on the national stage, leading the fight for a fair equalization deal, but also a true leader here in our province and in community. I was fortunate enough to live down the street from the Calverts for a few years when they were in the alphabet, when he was member for Riversdale. So he was on Avenue E, they were on Avenue E, we were on Avenue F. And he's a pretty special person, Mr. Calvert, on so many levels. But one of those levels is just how approachable and kind this Premier is and always has been. And I remember as a medical student, he let me come and bend his ear in the Saskatoon Cabinet office and try to convince him that the switch clinic that was getting started up on 20th Street was a good idea. And he listened to a young man who he had really no reason to listen to, and got behind our project, and the government supported it. And that meant a lot. And it meant a lot to have Mr. Calvert as one of the first people who encouraged me to pursue a career in politics, and I've mostly forgiven him for that advice. And I count myself, my colleagues perhaps have not, I count myself as one of many who have been encouraged and inspired by the work of this Premier, his legacy as Premier, his legacy as a leader, but also just someone who is so truly humble, kind, funny. You can listen to Lauren Calvert tell stories all day, and truly someone who I believe embodies the spirit of this province. So to all members, please join me in welcoming our 13th Premier, Mr. Calvert, and Betty to their legislature.
Recognize the member from Kenora-Pelly.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for an extended introduction.
Leave has been requested. Is leave granted? Carried.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I would like to introduce some guests in your gallery. Ken Corvetts, a former member of Legislative Assembly and Government of Saskatchewan Cabinet, and his wife Gail. Gerald Lusick, Chair of the Saskatchewan-Ukrainian Relations Advisory Committee, and they're accompanied by Linda Chemitek, Senior International Relations Officer for Ministry of Trade and Export and Development. Mr. Speaker, it is a pleasure to introduce some very special guests in there today. I'm pleased to welcome Ken Corvetts, a former member, and Ken is a familiar face to most of us here. He has had a long history in serving in the community, which began when he was first elected to the school division and the Board of Education back in 1985 in Kenora. He went to serve the province as an MLA for Kenora-Pelly and a cabinet, and in cabinet as Deputy Premier, Minister of Education, and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Corvetts is actively involved in the Ukrainian Canadian community here in Saskatchewan, including having previously served as the lead secretary to the Premier in Saskatchewan-Ukrainian relations. In 2016, he received the Shevchenko Medal Award of Public Service. This award is the highest form of recognition granted to Ukrainian Canadian Congress. This was not the first time that Mr. Corvetts had been recognized for his contribution to Ukrainian culture. In 2009, he was presented the Order of Prince Yaroslav the Wise, the highest honor of non-citizen of Ukraine can receive, by Ukrainian's then-President Viktor Yushchenko, in recognition for his efforts in ensuring the passage of Ukrainian famine and genocide. Holodomor Memorial Day act through this very legislation. Mr. Speaker, my other special guest is Mr. Gerald Lusick. He is the chair of the Saskatchewan-Ukrainian Relations Advisory Committee. He also sits as the advisory council to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress National Chapter. Gerald is an agrologist by training. He has served in a number of senior executive roles with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. He has an extensive international project experience in Ukraine, China, and Russia. Mr. Speaker, as you may know, this week is International Holodomor Remembrance Week. Earlier today, we held a Holodomor memorial service, and I had the opportunity of placing a wreath at the Holodomor statue outside the building to honor the memory of those who perished in 1932-33 famine genocide. We are honored to have these two very special guests with us today, and I invite all members to join me in welcoming them to the Legislative Assembly during this important time of remembrance of the people of Ukraine and for the citizens of our province who are of Ukrainian heritage. Please welcome them.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd also like to extend a warm welcome and introduce our special guests here this morning, the Honourable Mr. Ken Kravets and Gerald Luchik. We know Mr. Kravets is a former member of this Assembly, and Mr. Luchik had the honour of being outside earlier today at the ceremony that was mentioned by the member opposite. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not a person of Ukrainian heritage, but I did have an opportunity to spend several months in Western Ukraine as a young man. As a university student, I traveled to Ukraine with a teammate that I was playing university football with, and we worked with an organization in Western Ukraine administering camps and orphanages, working in the community. I lived with a family, billeted, and really became immersed in Ukrainian culture, which was very meaningful for me in those formative years. And that's something that inspired an interest in Ukrainian culture, politics, and history. And with that in mind, I also want to join in congratulating Mr. Kravets for his recognition by the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. And I do so as the MLA for Saskatoon Eastview, where we have a large number of Ukrainian Canadians living there. We, of course, have All Saints Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as well as St. Volodymyr's Villa. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask all members to join me in welcoming Mr. Kravets and Mr. Luchuk to their legislature, and also want to thank them for joining with us in remembrance for the people of Ukraine during the ceremony earlier today. Welcome here. Thank you.
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with colleagues across the floor, on both sides of the floor, in welcoming Ken and Gail Kravets to their Legislative Assembly. First, Gail, who's an esteemed author in her own right, wrote a very interesting book that I would encourage all to read. I think many on this side, I hope many on this side, have read the book at least a number of times. I welcome Gail to her Assembly, but also thank her for her support of Ken over his decades of service on the floor of this Assembly as well. It's documented. My friend Ken served in multiple ministerial profiles. He's the Deputy Premier of this province, Mr. Speaker. But I would like to just say thank you for something else that Ken has done even after his elected life, and that is his taking the time to provide really a mentorship role for myself, I know for many other of my colleagues, elected members on the floor, but also a number of staff within government. And I want to really thank Ken for the effort that he has made since his time on this Assembly, Mr. Speaker, in providing and being that mentorship role. While he was on the floor of this Assembly, and you'll note at times I might raise my voice in this Assembly, you can thank Ken for that. I was Ken's seatmate for a period of time. You'll notice others in this Assembly don't hear very well alongside myself, and it's because Ken also would raise his voice in this Assembly, and there are many ears that have been damaged due to Ken's piercing voice. The former Premier, the 14th Premier, would agree with me on this, Mr. Speaker. But I do want to welcome Ken and Gail to their Assembly, and just make another note, Mr. Speaker. If you look at Ken and his wife Gail behind them, we have Saskatchewan's 13th Premier, Roy, and his wife, Betty Romano. We are very... Never forgive me for that. Premier Calvert and his wife Betty in our Assembly, Mr. Speaker. We are so very fortunate to have these guests with us here today. Here.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Requesting leave for an extended introduction.
Leave has been requested. Is leave granted? Carried.
Thank you. I just would like to join in briefly with the members and the Premier that have welcomed the delegation from the United Canadian Ukrainian Congress that's here today, Mr. Luchik, for the Holodomor and the remembrance of that atrocity. That was a beautiful ceremony here today. And I also want to join in welcoming Ken Kravets to his Assembly, and to Gail as well. And Ken, this is the quietest I've ever seen you in this Assembly. I want to say thank you to you for your leadership, particularly around recognizing the Holodomor and the famine, the genocide, the atrocity that occurred, and for being a part of that work along with the community to bring about the memorial that we stood at there today, and making sure that this chamber properly recognized that horrible chapter in the lives of so many, and so many that are impacted here in Saskatchewan. I also want to say to Ken Kravets that, just to riff on the Premier's comments, boy, that guy could bring it in this House as far as the volume. I remember coming in here as a young new critic for education, appointed by then Leader of the Opposition, Calvert, and coming in here with questions to ask Ken Kravets. And I remember getting up for that first one and watching his pitch and tone sort of come up to about here. And for a good number of years following, we would holler at each other in question period. Him as the Minister of Education and Finance, me as the critic for education and finance, but someone that I knew always cared deeply about his province. So it's a pleasure to welcome Ken Kravets and Gail Kravets to their assembly as well. And I'd be remiss not to recognize someone who's had so much incredible impact in this province. Two people that have had so much impact in this province, the life of this province. Premier Calvert and Betty Calvert, it's an incredible honor to have you in the Assembly here today. You made this province a better place. You made many people's lives better. Your efforts as servants of the people of Saskatchewan need to be celebrated. Premier Calvert was somebody who was always very clear that social progress and economic progress go hand in hand. And his records on those fronts are ones that needs to be celebrated. Social and economic progress, social innovation that made a difference in so many lives, and somebody that really set the stage and organized the conditions and the structures and the incentives to usher in a boom, a period of unprecedented economic development. And let me be clear, that Premier always knew very clearly where the proceeds of that prosperity should go, and that's to improve the lives of Saskatchewan people. I had the privilege to serve with Premier Calvert while he served as the Leader of the Opposition for a couple years. You won't find a more genuine, more honest, more humble, more decent, more compassionate person, or a person who was more focused on the future of this province, and not just those four-year terms, but generations. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a finer orator. These are two remarkable people that have made a remarkable difference in the life of our province and the lives of so many. It's my honor to welcome Premier Calvert and Betty Calvert to their assembly.
I recognize a member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to be on my feet to welcome a very special guest to your gallery. To you and through you, I want to extend a warm welcome to a constituent of mine, Kathy Curry. Kathy grew up on a farm north of Tisdale. She's now a proud resident of Regina Elphinstone Centre. She's a former teacher, a small business entrepreneur, a talented seamstress, and she possesses a rare intellectual curiosity, which led her to undertake a project that I will be speaking on during a member statement, so I won't give it all away. But I do want to recognize Kathy for her outstanding contribution to Saskatchewan and welcome her warmly to her legislature.
Recognize a member from Arm River. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you and to all members, I'm thrilled to introduce and welcome here for his first time, 17-year-old constituent of mine seated in your gallery, Derek Griffin. Derek hails from the beautiful area of the Lorburn, Elbow area, and lives on the family ranch, so it's fair to say that he's grown up around cattle and crops his whole life. He's a grade 12 student from the Lorburn Central School and is involved in hockey and football and most invested in high school rodeo, and he's quite an accomplished team roper, as a matter of fact. But really, Mr. Speaker, what sets him apart from others his age would be the fact that he is so keenly interested in politics and certainly hopes to follow a career path that involves politics one day.
He and I actually connected during my nomination, but most recently we connected through his high school. He's involved in a program called the Career and Work Exploration Program. And that program is about learning about the world of work, but also about exploring a career passion that you might have. And so this is a passion for him. This is school for him today. And the two of us have spent some time together, and I've tried to provide him with some insights, certainly tried not to turn him off from the career, but hopefully fueled his enthusiasm for being involved in this. He's a great young man, he's excited to be here, and I would ask all members in welcoming Derek to his legislature.
Presenting petitions. I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling on the Government of Saskatchewan to restore microbiology lab services in rural Saskatchewan. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that the Government of Saskatchewan is cutting life-saving microbiology testing from the Yorkton Regional Hospital. Samples will be sent to Regina for processing. The Yorkton lab currently processes thousands of tests every year. Government says there won't be a delay in processing, but with one courier a day from Yorkton to Regina, if you're not there by the cutoff time, your specimen will not get to the Regina lab until the next day. If the roads are impassable due to snow, as we have seen recently, samples will not get to Regina in a timely manner. Centralization of health services in Regina increases the workload for staff and erodes our community's ability to recruit and retain medical professionals. And lab staff in Yorkton have the skills, expertise, and know-how to get tests processed in a timely manner. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to immediately restore rural lab services and ensure that residents of Yorkton and area have community-based microbiology testing on a go-forward basis. This is signed by individuals from Yorkton and Kamsack. Mr. Speaker, I do so present.
Recognize a member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to be on my feet today to present a petition to the Legislative Assembly calling for the funding of in vitro fertilization treatments in Saskatchewan. On Saturday morning, Mr. Speaker, I was out in the community and I had a woman literally fall into my arms crying. So glad that someone was talking about this, as she had just lost another baby and had maxed out her credit cards, Mr. Speaker. She and the undersigned residents in the province of Saskatchewan wish to bring to our attention the following: that 1 in 6 couples in Canada experience infertility, that IVF treatments are prohibitively expensive for many, with one cycle typically costing at least $10,000. That Saskatchewan people's ability to conceive should not depend on their socioeconomic status, and that investing in people determined to grow their families here in Saskatchewan makes economic sense. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan immediately move to cover the financial burden of 2 rounds of IVF treatments for Saskatchewan people experiencing infertility. Mr. Speaker, the signatories of this petition reside in Tisdale and Weldon. I do so present.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to once again rise to present our petition calling for pay equity legislation. Mr. Speaker, it is the unfortunate reality that jobs commonly held by women tend to be paid less than jobs commonly held by men, even when the work is comparable in value based on skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. Pay equity legislation is necessary because it addresses the undervaluation of women's work. Those who have signed the petition wish to bring to our attention the following points. Saskatchewan is one of only 4 provinces that does not have pay equity legislation. Saskatchewan has one of the highest gender wage gaps in all of Canada, which is the result of systemic gender discrimination in compensation. The Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission has recommended proactive and comprehensive pay equity legislation, which has not been pursued by the Government of Saskatchewan. I'll now read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to introduce pay equity legislation. Mr. Speaker, the petition today has been signed by residents of Saskatoon. I do so present.
Recognize a member from Regina Alpha-Stone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm on my feet to again present a petition calling for changes to the new CIS program, which represents further cuts to social assistance while people are still experiencing the economic fallout of a pandemic, Mr. Speaker. The signatories of this petition wish to bring to this House's attention that CIS represents further cuts to what were already inadequate social assistance amounts. There's been a change so that rent and utilities are not directly paid, and these unprecedented these unprecedented changes have led to increased evictions, arrears, and homelessness. I believe it was Saturday morning, my little one got me out of bed at about 7 a.m. and insisted we go outside, and it was already 25 below. We are in the middle of a biting prairie winter, and more people than ever are living out on the streets. It's a shame, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I will read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the government to restore direct payment of rent and utilities for income support clients. The signatories of this petition reside in Regina. I do so present.
Hear, hear.
Recognize a member from Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to the Government of Saskatchewan to fix the crisis in our classrooms. Those who signed this petition wish to draw our attention to a number of issues. One, that the 2021-22 provincial budget for education did not fully fund fixed costs, inflation, growth, or barely fund the teacher's contract and amounts to a cut. That the Sask Party government's cuts means continued falling per-student funding and fewer supports for students as they recover from the impact of COVID-19. That after years of underfunding, school divisions have nowhere left to cut that will not impact student learning. And that the Sask Party government's failure to invest in our classrooms is having consequences today and will continue into the future. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to immediately fix the crisis in our classrooms by providing stable and adequate per-student funding for public education in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, those who have signed this petition today reside in Moose Jaw and in Regina. I do so present.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Centre.
Miigwech, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be on my feet again today to present the following petition. This government has been selling off Crown land with no meaningful duty to consult. The current duty to consult policy is outdated and does not reflect the TRC calls to action and UNDRIP. The current process of emailing notices, one-off meetings with one or two people is not duty to consult, and it does not work. Has this government ever asked the Indigenous community how they would like to be consulted? The lack of meaningful duty to consult policy leaves the taxpayers of Saskatchewan footing the bill for the government of Saskatchewan's mistakes and losses in courts. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to immediately stop the sell-off of Crown land and work with First Nation and Métis communities to develop a duty to consult framework. The folks that signed this petition reside in Momart and Craven. I do so present.
I recognize a member from Saskatoon-Nutana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to present a petition calling on the government to save our swales. The residents in Saskatchewan wish to bring to your attention the following. The Ministry of Highways is planning a four-way high-speed highway around part of Saskatoon and through the swales. The northeast and small swales of Saskatoon provide habitat and food to a number of endangered and declining species and many others not listed as endangered. The province and the provincial government is neglecting its environmental protection duties to adequately protect wild species, habitats, and ecosystems of local, regional, national, and global significance. Lack of adequate protection is leading to a decrease in many types of wildlife species habitat, particularly grassland habitat. Highways impact ecosystems through fragmentation, but assessments of their environmental impacts are only done through site-specific boundaries, ignoring regional cumulative impacts. I'll read the prayer as follows. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the provincial government to, number one, suspend planning for the Saskatoon Freeway and development around the swales until a regional cumulative effects assessment has been completed. Number two, update the Wildlife Act and expand the list of wild species protected by provincial regulation. 3, recognize the swales as important ecological habitat and designate them as protected areas. And finally, ensure adequate long-term funding for research, management, and enforcement to protect the swales for generations to come. The petition is signed by residents from Saskatoon. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions, statements by members. I recognize the member for Kenora-Pelly.
Dякую, panie Speaker. On Saturday, November 27th, we will commemorate the 88th anniversary of Holodomor famine genocide of 1932-33. Mr. Speaker, during this Holodomor, the Soviet regime killed millions of Ukrainians by starving them of their agricultural products. Stalin declared food to be illegal for Ukrainian farmers, and Soviet troops confiscated grain and livestock. Farmers found to be hiding in the grain were shot on sight. The Soviet blocked the villages from receiving food to ensure the people suffered. People ate grass, tree bark, and anything they could keep themselves from starving. The word Holodomor, literally translated from Ukrainian, means death by hunger. Mr. Speaker, Canada has very strong ties to Ukraine, having the third highest Ukrainian population in the world. The Holodomor has only been recognized as an act of genocide by 16 countries, Canada being one. The Holodomor was a terrible atrocity by the Soviet government, resulting in unnecessary death of millions of Ukrainians. Mr. Speaker, we condemn these crimes, and we pray for the day that Ukrainians can live in peace. But for now, we will continue to remember the Holodomor and the millions of Ukrainians' lives that were lost. Never, ever again. Вечная память. Спасибо, panie Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to recognize a very special project undertaken by a special constituent of mine, Kathy Curry. Kathy was raised on a farm north of Tisdale on Treaty 4. Growing up in close family proximity to residential schools, she eventually realized she hadn't had an honest exposure to the facts. Like so many, she heard and believed good news stories about settler-Indigenous relations as a child. This conflicted with the devastating experiences relayed by countless Indigenous neighbours. Inspired by the TRC calls to action, Kathy took up the challenge of reconciliation on a deeply personal level. She set out to create a treaty map to educate others. A talented seamstress, the project started out as a textile panel, but it quickly became clear how little information was out there. Working diligently with partners, including the First Nations University, the Stewart Resources Centre, the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, and the ISC, Kathy's 4-year journey culminated with a commissioned map, which is now a teaching resource by the Ministry of Education. The Saskatchewan Rural Municipalities and Treaty Boundaries map is now proudly displayed in offices and institutions across Saskatchewan, including by many of my colleagues. Without truth, there cannot be reconciliation, Mr. Speaker. Kathy's project encourages thoughtful, informed reflection on both our personal and collective roles in reconciliation. I would ask all members to join me in recognizing Kathy for her truly unique and historic contribution to our province.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Saskatchewan Order of Merit celebrates remarkable citizens of our great province. Today, I would like to recognize one of its recipients, Albert Brown of Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, Albert teaches kindness and compassion, something he believes can make society a better place. He is the founder and former coordinator of John School. The program provides a safe space for former Johns and prostitutes to examine their involvement in the sex industry. Its focus is to educate Johns about the negative effects of prostitution has on society, which has contributed greatly towards eliminating human trafficking in Saskatoon. Participants of John School are individuals that have been charged with soliciting prostitution for the first time. They have access to a health nurse who talks to them about STIs, law enforcement officers, and their families, all of which help them to understand the impacts of their choices. Mr. Speaker, the program is supported by the Saskatchewan Ministry of Justice and the Salvation Army, and upon completion provides participants the opportunity to have their criminal record revoked. A vital tool that has empowered those victimized by sex trafficking or plagued by shame and fear see a possibility for a brighter future. I now ask all members to please join me in congratulating Albert Brown for giving a voice to those who were once trafficked and voiceless, and on his legacy of empowerment. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon University.
Mr. Speaker, last month the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada launched an online petition in support of the private members' bill I had introduced last spring. Bill 605, an act to provide access to abortion services, called for the implementation of access zones to limit protests around facilities that provide abortion services. In a matter of weeks, this petition has garnered nearly 25,000 signatories calling on the government of Saskatchewan to bring in this legislation. People who access and provide abortion services at Saskatoon City Hospital and Regina General Hospital have been subjected to these protests for decades, Mr. Speaker. Harassment and intimidation is also a reality for those accessing and providing services at Saskatoon Sexual Health and Planned Parenthood Regina. Last spring, the Minister of Justice insisted that his government needed to ensure Bill 605 was charter compliant. Bill 605 closely follows British Columbia's law around access zones, Mr. Speaker, and BC's law has been upheld as constitutional. Yet still not a peep from the Minister of Justice on this bill. Nearly 25,000 people want to know, Mr. Speaker, when this government will stop dragging its heels on simple, meaningful bubble zone legislation for those providing and seeking this health care service. Mr. Speaker, I thank the thousands that have supported the work of our caucus to ensure safe, dignified abortion services in Saskatchewan.
Recognize the member from Arm River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to single out a hero that lives in my constituency. In fact, Les Kruger from Hanley is not new to the role of hero, but what took place on November 5th reminded us of what a hero he is. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Kruger has been a volunteer first responder in Hanley for over 30 years. And while he has attended countless emergency calls over the years, it's the call that came in at 2:30 p.m. on November 5th that serves as a reminder of the blessing that Les and all first responders are to Saskatchewan. That afternoon, a cardiac arrest call came in. In a situation where minutes matter, Les and a fellow firefighter were immediately on the scene. Their quick actions, which involved the use of CPR and an AED machine, saved the life of a fellow community member. Mr. Speaker, this is truly neighbour helping neighbour. Mr. Speaker, November is CPR month, a time when we draw focus on the importance of CPR training in Canada. Mr. Speaker, it is sometimes ordinary individuals like you and I, that are faced with extraordinary circumstances. It is mere hours of training that can literally save the life of a neighbour. And for one family in my constituency, there will be another joy-filled Christmas this year because someone named Les Kruger, many years ago, made the decision to learn CPR. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would ask all members in recognizing Les Kruger, dedicated first responder, CPR advocate, and Arm River hero. Thank you.
Recognize a member from Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Sask Weekly Newspaper Association named Michael Pilati as one of 4 Junior Citizens of the Year. A recent graduate from Carleton Comprehensive High School, Michael was diagnosed as deaf at birth and received cochlear implants. He took speech therapy, became a strong communicator, decorated athlete, and a guest speaker for charitable organizations. Michael played competitive volleyball, baseball, and was named to Saskatchewan's 2020 5-pin youth bowling team. He participated in fundraisers for the Royal Purple and Elks Walkathon, was a finalist in the Scotia Bank Game Changer competition, and works as a mentor for the Saskatchewan Alexander Graham Bell Camp for hearing-impaired children. Michael tried to do everything anyone his age would do, and more, Mr. Speaker. Brian Martin, who nominated Michael, says while his athletic accomplishments are impressive, it's his action and effort away from sports that make him worthy of the Junior Citizen Award. He nominated Michael because of who he is, someone who treats people with respect. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in congratulating Michael Pilati for his determination and his willingness to help others. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Cannington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to acknowledge the late Chris Suter. Chris was the founding president of Canadian Western Agribition in 1971. And Mr. Speaker, he would be very proud of this world-renowned agricultural show. On Monday, the burning of the brand officially opened the 50th anniversary of Agribition. Organizers honoured the Suter family and their dedication to the continued success of Canadian Western Agribition. Chris's sons, Spence and Dean, along with their wives Janice and Gail, burned the Canadian Western Agribition brand to open the show. The Suter family run Aqua Hollow Hereford Ranch near Red Rivers. Chris and his family quickly became known for the quality of their herd. In 1957, Chris won the first ever Grand Champion at the Toronto Royal Winter Fair. He served as president of both the Saskatchewan and Canadian Hereford Associations. He was inducted into the Northern International Livestock Exposition Hall of Fame, the Saskatchewan Agriculture Hall of Fame, and the Canadian Agricultural Hall of Fame. In 1988, Chris was awarded the Saskatchewan Order of Merit. Mr. Speaker, Chris Suter's passion for agriculture gave him the idea of hosting a major fall fair in Western Canada, known today as Canadian Western Agribition. Those humble beginnings, Mr. Speaker, led by the Saskatchewan cattlemen who knew they were starting something special directly in the heart of the prairies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question period. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 80 more Saskatchewan people have died from COVID-19 since this session began, and yet hardly a mention from this Premier. A Premier who's been more focused on political games than on the lives lost. Lives it was his job to protect. Yesterday, the Premier chose to shut down debate on the release of Dr. Shahab's recommendations. If he doesn't think that he did anything wrong, why is he so keen to hide the facts of those recommendations from Saskatchewan people?
Recognize the Government House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the Minister of Health and Premier spoke to this, but I want to be very clear for members for folks who are listening on TV about what that member is referring to as shutting down debate. Mr. Speaker, we adjourned the House at the conclusion of government orders yesterday, which is something that happens literally every day here and has for 20 years. What they were asking for, Mr. Speaker, is to go further than government orders into a whole number of items that come after government orders in the order paper, which never happened. So I just want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker. That's a highly technical answer, but what the member is asserting is completely outrageous, Mr. Speaker. They have other mechanisms in which they can bring the issue they want to the floor of the Assembly. But let's be very clear, what the member is stating is completely not in line with how this place works.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier chose to shut down debate, refused to have the question of whether recommendations from Dr. Shahab should be released. He refused to even discuss whether the people of Saskatchewan deserve to know why. He ignored the recommendations on masking, on proof of vaccination that led to hundreds of deaths. This Premier sat on his hands and people died, and he doesn't want us to know what really happened. So to the Premier, if you don't want to debate it, why not just release the papers?
Recognize the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, well, once again, what the member is alleging is verging on what I would characterize in an unparliamentary way. I won't do it. But, Mr. Speaker, what that member is alleging is completely not in line with how the chamber works, and he should know that. I know he's a relatively new member to the chamber, Mr. Speaker, but he should know, and he should have people who would advise him to that effect, Mr. Speaker. The Premier and the Minister of Health have spoken to the substance of the matter already, Mr. Speaker. But what that member is saying with regard to House procedure and the assertion that government was somehow stifling debate is completely untrue.
Here.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The highest COVID death rate in the entire country. Hundreds of deaths because of this Premier's failure to act. The lowest vaccination rate in the country. The worst fourth wave. Thousands of people left without care. We're simply asking, will the Premier release the recommendations, or will he hide behind procedure? Will he hide behind his House Leader?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we acted on the recommendations that Dr. Shahab provided. Mr. Speaker, we've answered.
Keep performing, Ryan.
Mr. Speaker, we've spoken to this many times in this Assembly, Mr. Speaker. In the middle of September, we moved on an indoor mandatory masking order across the province, Mr. Speaker. We moved on a recommendation with respect to gathering sizes, Mr. Speaker, and we moved on a proof of vaccination, proof of negative test policy. Mr. Speaker, those are out under Dr. Shahab's signature, and I would put forward that they are working in this province, Mr. Speaker. Since that time, we have delivered over 200,000 vaccines, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, as of today, we have started taking bookings for 5 to 11-year-olds, Mr. Speaker. My understanding is that we have over 12,000 5 to 11-year-olds that have booked an appointment as of this morning, Mr. Speaker. We will be the first province to deliver vaccines starting tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, all of this is working. Our active case counts in this province are down some 80%. And once again, through you to the people of this province, Mr. Speaker, I say thank you. Thank you for what you have done to bend the COVID case counts, to reduce our hospitalizations. Thank you for what you have done. The vast majority have went out and gotten vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. It is working here in the province.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The worst fourth wave in the entire country, and the Premier is hiding the facts. He refuses to release that information that we know from Dr. Shahab's public comments, from this Premier's public comments that he ignored. Now, Mr. Speaker, along with ignoring the experts, this Sask Party government is constantly shutting down leaders who would go above and beyond and try to keep people safe. Internal CIC documents show that the president of SGI wanted to bring back masking for employees. On August 26th, as the fourth wave was raging through the province, he tried to bring back masking, but this government wouldn't let them. Why did the Premier block SGI from protecting its staff and customers with something as simple as masks?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I want to be able to correct the record again. Mr. Speaker, we did act on Dr. Shahab's recommendations in the middle of September. We put it. I know the members opposite don't like this. There's lots of members over there that are talking, Mr. Speaker, that never get to their feet and ask a question. If they'd like to ask a question, there's a process. Stand up and ask the question. Mr. Speaker, we have worked. That's why we've had almost 200,000 vaccines in arms, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we should be talking about today is that we are going to be the first ones in this country to deliver vaccinations to children between 5 and 11, Mr. Speaker. We have almost 12,000 appointments that were booked between 8 and 1 o'clock today, Mr. Speaker. There's 45,000 appointments available, Mr. Speaker. We hope that the parents will have those important discussions with their children on the importance of getting vaccinated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, a health minister, a premier, trying to rewrite history from the public health disaster that their actions created. The SGI president in his email said, and I quote, "There is strong science to support that masking protects people from exposure to the aerosols that transmit COVID-19. But the response from CIC was clear. The direction was from the top. And I quote, "Nope, it's been given to us pretty clear." The email said there's to be no re-implementation of any restrictions or any mandates. This was on August 26th, Mr. Speaker. Again, why did the Premier and his government stop leaders in his crowns from taking the steps to protect Saskatchewan people?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Premier and I were very clear in July when we removed public health restrictions, Mr. Speaker. If somebody wanted to wear a mask and was comfortable in wearing a mask in a public place, they should do so, Mr. Speaker. They should always do that. Dr. Shahab has talked about it. I've talked about it many times. If people wanted to do that, Mr. Speaker, they have to do a personal risk assessment of what is going on, what events they're going to, whether they're vaccinated at that time, Mr. Speaker, whether they're partially vaccinated or fully vaccinated. We always encouraged people to be able to wear masks if they wanted to, Mr. Speaker. That includes the people within the public service with all our crowns. If they wanted to wear a mask, Mr. Speaker, they certainly could have. We weren't stopping that, Mr. Speaker. We were very clear in this chamber and out in the rotunda about that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister is embarrassing himself. This is a government that stood against mask mandates, that had modeling in front of them, that said that masks would cut the cases in half, and yet they chose to ignore it. Not only ignore it, when the SGI tried to bring in a masking mandate, this minister, this premier, said no. Another email sent to senior officials in the CIC said, and I quote, "The Premier has been very clear. There's no intent to reintroduce masking, mandate vaccines, or implement restrictions at this time in the broader public sector." Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, did any other crowns try to bring in protections and he stepped in and got in their way as well?
I'd like to caution the Leader of the Opposition not to make personal comments. I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll reiterate for the members opposite what we have done, Mr. Speaker, under Dr. Shahab's guidance. We did implement a mask mandate, Mr. Speaker, in all public places, and because of that, it's gone down. Our cases have gone down by 79% in our 7-day average, Mr. Speaker. Again, we have just over 1,000 active cases in our province, and this isn't because of what the government did. This is the hard work of the people of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, that have been continuing to adhere to the public health guidelines, Mr. Speaker, and sometimes going above what the government has done, Mr. Speaker, which is their prerogative. Mr. Speaker, we continue to support the people of Saskatchewan with making sure that they have the opportunity in the summer to be able to do that, Mr. Speaker, but it's interesting how this party over here is always looking at COVID through the rearview mirror, Mr. Speaker. We are looking at what's happening right here, right now, Mr. Speaker, and we're working on what's going to happen with booster shots, bringing in Johnson & Johnson, Mr. Speaker, and also that 5 to 11-year-olds will be the first ones in this country to be vaccinated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure that the over 900 families who have lost a loved one due to COVID-19 would think that it was looking in the rearview mirror to regret those losses, Mr. Speaker. The Premier blocked our crowns from implementing mask mandates. They blocked Saskatoon from gathering restrictions to protect that city at the height of the fourth wave. They tried to block a local public health officer from introducing mandates during an outbreak in a school, Mr. Speaker. Block, block, block. The incompetence of this minister is staggering, but why is he so insistent on making sure that no one else can do a good job either?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. And I understand the concerns of the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, but he was talking about the SGI memo, Mr. Speaker, which is looking backwards, Mr. Speaker. We always encouraged people, if they wanted to wear a mask and if they felt comfortable wearing a mask, they should do that, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you what's happening in the province right here, Mr. Speaker, is we are going to be, again, the first ones in the country. We started our booking this morning, Mr. Speaker. We were able to book in 12,000 people. Even though we did have a couple little hiccups, Mr. Speaker, we were able to get that back up and running. There are 45,000 open appointments right now. I think I'm encouraging parents to have that discussion with their children to be able to discuss whether they want to get vaccinated. Every person that is vaccinated in this province, Mr. Speaker, helps out. I wish the opposition could get on board with that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, this government is claiming that the minister's infamous letter to school divisions last week was simply providing clarity. That's not what he told the media. Quote, I was hearing from parents in my constituency based on an event that was going on, so I put out the letter. End the quote. Mr. Speaker, how often do ministerial decrees go out to appease a few constituents?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this certainly was in keeping with the letter that went out by the Deputy Minister of Health on Monday that preceded my letter, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, based on not only one event that was upcoming, but obviously a season where there's going to be lots of events that will take place perhaps in schools, I felt it was appropriate to clarify the position of the government, and that is that it should be parents that decide whether children are going to be vaccinated, Mr. Speaker, not the government, Mr. Speaker. That is certainly the position of the government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and that's the position that we'll have going forward. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier wouldn't answer this question yesterday, so let's try the minister. Does he think that it's appropriate to use the power of his office to override the decisions made by a local medical health officer?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, students in this province have a right to an education. They have a right to take part fully as possible in the school year, whether that be in-class learning or whether that be other activities that are associated with the school year. Mr. Speaker, including extracurricular activities, including arts and culture, and including sports. That is the position of the government. Mr. Speaker, we have provided a number of resources to school divisions to ensure that activities can be safe, such as 750,000 rapid tests that arrived in this province, and many of those went to schools. I would encourage school divisions to use those to ensure that classrooms can be safe, whether that be in class or other activities associated with in-class learning. Mr. Speaker, and that's the advice that I'll, in the direction that I'll continue to give school divisions. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, that letter caused chaos and confusion, and he ought to know it. And it included, Mr. Speaker, some pretty liberal interpretations of the Education Act that I know were a surprise to many in the education sector. So I'll ask the minister directly, did he come up with that letter on his own, based solely on the feedback that he heard from his constituency?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Absolutely not, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, before the letter was sent, Dr. Shahab looked at the letter and signed off on the contents of the letter, which is in keeping with the information that he gave to the public on November 18th, where he said not have a situation where unvaccinated children cannot attend in-class learning or other activities that are so important for them. It's not their fault that their parents choose to not get them vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, it's in keeping with the advice that's been given by Dr. Shahab, which the previous questions, they asked the government to listen to Dr. Shahab, and here's an instance where we are, Mr. Speaker, and now they don't like the information that was sent by the minister to school divisions. And it's also keeping with the advice of NACI, who says we ought not to stigmatize children based on a decision that is not their decision. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, that minister knows very well that that doesn't clear it up. Yesterday, we rolled out a plan to vaccinate kids between 5 to 11 years old. And Mr. Speaker, yes, this is a very important time. And yet the Minister of Health had this to say, and I quote, "We do not want to create two classes of children, vaccinated and unvaccinated." End the quote. Does the Minister of Health regret using divisive language from the anti-vax playbook that further politicizes vaccinations, just as we're trying to protect our kids and schools?
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I would hope the member is not suggesting that the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations is dividing kids into two classes, is politicizing immunizations in children in this province and in this country. The National Advisory Committee on Immunizations speaks specifically in their recommendation to approve for 5 to 11-year-olds, talks specifically about not stigmatizing children based on a decision that is not their decision. It is certainly not the position of this government, and I would hope the member from the STF, the member who is an active member of the STF, agrees with this, that we not kick students out as young as kindergarten because of a decision that their parents make. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to have kindergarten teachers in this province, Mr. Speaker, ask kids, do you have your lunch? Do you have your extra change of clothes? Do you have your QR code? You don't? Well, get out of here. Beat it. We're not going to do that in this province.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, he knows that's not what she was saying. This is dog whistle politics at its worst. Mr. Speaker, this pandemic has taught us many things. Chief among them, what an essential role our healthcare workers play in our health system. That's why in March we called for this government to address chronic short staffing and create a plan to fill vacant positions. Why didn't this government listen? And now, will they take responsibility for the hospitals across the province that are shuttered because they don't have enough staff?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I just said yesterday, I want to first off thank the healthcare workers across this province, across our country and around the world that are keeping us safe, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our role as government is to be able to provide them with that support, and we have been able, but they have done an amazing job in pivoting, Mr. Speaker, into an area which most of them were trained for, Mr. Speaker. They were able to move into that area to be able to protect us, not just on the offensive side of COVID, but on the defensive side of COVID, doing immunizations, Mr. Speaker, on mass clinics, but also, Mr. Speaker, inside our healthcare systems. And in the summer, we moved them back into their original positions, most that we could, and we got 95% of our surgeries that were scheduled done at that time. Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, in September and October, they had to pivot back to be able to protect for the fourth wave. Now we're moving them back into their original positions. We're on track, Mr. Speaker, to be able to get to that 90% by the end of the month, and I can't thank the healthcare workers enough, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Those are welcome words, Mr. Speaker, but these healthcare workers need action. Chronic short staffing under this government isn't new, Mr. Speaker, but it was made so much worse by this pandemic. Yesterday, the Registered Psychiatric Nurses Association released their needs assessment report. It affirms what we knew, that there are serious gaps in staffing, training, and access to mental health care. Mr. Speaker, there are currently 156 unfilled RPN positions and 2 unopened units at Sask Hospital because the province doesn't have the supply. What is the plan to fill these vacant positions?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Well, I could tell the member opposite what the plan was, Mr. Speaker. It started in 2007, when we hired 4,000 more nurses from then until now, Mr. Speaker. 1,000 more doctors, Mr. Speaker, to be able to meet the growing needs of this province, Mr. Speaker. I know they don't like talking about this, Mr. Speaker, but these are the facts, Mr. Speaker. Can you imagine? I'd like the members opposite to be able to address this. What kind of crisis this province would be in under them if they had 4,000 less nurses, Mr. Speaker? But under them, we wouldn't have to worry about that, Mr. Speaker, because the province would never grow. It would continue to be declining year over year, Mr. Speaker. This government, while we have the responsibility and the honour of forming government, Mr. Speaker, will continue to grow this province, and we will also continue to grow the people within our healthcare system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Fear-mongering and nonsense, Mr. Speaker. This needs assessment is happening in 2021. Today, and it's their responsibility. 73 additional seats are needed annually to close the gap over the next 6 years. Yet there's no concrete plan to support our burnt-out healthcare workers and still no plan to increase RPNs to better support those with mental health and addictions. When will we see a concrete plan to increase the supply of RPNs and other desperately needed positions so that Saskatchewan people can get health care they need when they need it?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and it's a very similar answer to what I had before, Mr. Speaker. But again, on top of that, on top of their record, which the former member from Regina Northwest used to say, Mr. Speaker, they closed 52 hospitals. Then he said, oh, that was good. They maybe needed to be closed, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition doubled down on that and said that the member was absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. Could you imagine what we would have if we had those 52 hospitals, Mr. Speaker, and had the staff to be able to work in those hospitals? Mr. Speaker, this government has a huge commitment, the largest healthcare budget, over $6 billion into our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker, to be able to provide that quality of care. And again, Mr. Speaker, I cannot thank the healthcare workers enough that have been doing an amazing job. They are the heroes within our province, Mr. Speaker, and the opposition members should treat them like that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very clear that they don't have a plan. He hasn't even come close to answering this question and just brings up these tired old lines that people are sick of hearing. They are the government today. They have a responsibility right now to fill this need. Mr. Speaker, 46% of RPNs are having to take overtime. 43% said there are critical labor shortages in their units. Now in our fourth wave, healthcare workers are tired, burnt out, and either leaving the profession or leaving the province altogether because of this government's inaction. Does the minister recognize that his inaction means that healthcare workers are overworked and patients aren't receiving the care they need?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If the members opposite haven't noticed, we've been dealing with a pandemic. There are lots of healthcare workers that are earning overtime right now because they're doing an amazing job, Mr. Speaker. As I just mentioned, they've had to move from one position to another, sometimes doing something that they weren't traditionally trained in, but they adapted extremely quickly, Mr. Speaker, and we're very proud of what they've done. They were able to adapt again, Mr. Speaker, in moving back to their original positions where the Premier and I outlined that we were going to get 90% of these done by the end of the month, Mr. Speaker. I was informed by the SHA this morning that we're on target to be able to do that on Monday, Mr. Speaker. And again, I can't thank those healthcare workers enough. I wish the members opposite could certainly get on board and start thanking the healthcare workers. Stop talking about dollars and cents and start talking about the proper patient care. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ministerial statements. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A few years ago, our government adopted a new policy for naming buildings and other provincial landmarks after former premiers, and that policy led to the naming of a number of buildings and landmarks in this province. Started with the Alan Blakeney Adult Campus, which was formerly the Regina Public Schools Adult Campus, Mr. Speaker. We named the Grant Devine Lake and the Grant Devine Dam, which is the reservoir and dam that is near Alameda. The Roy Romano Provincial Laboratory, which was formerly the Saskatchewan Provincial Laboratory in Regina, and the W. Ross Thatcher Building, the main building at the Moose Jaw campus of Saskatchewan Polytechnic. Going forward, Mr. Speaker, how the policy is put in place is that each Premier would have the opportunity to name a provincial building or a landmark after not the immediate past Premier, but the one previous to that. And that means that I, today, Mr. Speaker, have the honour and the responsibility of naming something after Saskatchewan's 13th Premier, the Honourable Lauren Calvert. Absolutely. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you this is a responsibility that I take very seriously and have taken very seriously. And now I should note that I don't personally know the former Premier Calvert. Our time in this House did not overlap. Other than a couple of brief encounters that we may have had over the years, we've never really had the chance to sit down and have a lengthy conversation. That said, I feel I might know former Premier Calvert a little better than maybe one might think. He became a Premier, Mr. Speaker, not through a general election, but following a very close and contested leadership race. He took over from a very popular three-term Premier, Mr. Speaker, of which I had jumped the gun to introduce here earlier today. Mr. Speaker, I think it's fair to say that he was seen at that point in time as possibly being a little lower key and possibly even a little less flashy than his predecessor. But he made that leadership style work, and it worked very well for him. He had to find a way to chart his own course while at the time carrying on the direction of his party and the direction of government. It's not an easy balance, but he most certainly did it. And I would expect during the first couple of years in office, he looked forward to the chance to earn his own mandate from the voters, of which he did in 2003, and much to the dismay of this party and likely somewhat to the dismay of the gentleman seated in front of him. But I feel, Mr. Speaker, while I say I don't really know former Premier Calvert, in many ways I feel like I do. And like I said, I took this responsibility very seriously. I wanted to ensure that whatever we chose to name was appropriate and that it was meaningful to former Premier Calvert and his family. And I think today we are accomplishing that. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce that the River Park Campground, a section of the River Park walking trail in the Wakama Valley Park in Moose Jaw, will be renamed the Lauren Calvert Campground and the Lauren Calvert Loop to honour our 13th Premier, former Premier Lauren Calvert. I wanted to say a few things about why this was fitting and why it was a meaningful tribute to Lauren and his family. But then I read what he had said in a statement that he had put out, and this is what he said, and I quote, "The recognition in Wakama is particularly meaningful for myself and our family. 4 generations of my family have grown up learning of life and God's creation within the valley. Betty and I now, with our children and our grandchildren, have spent some of the happiest days of our lives camped in parks and campgrounds, and that includes the Wakama Campground. Very honored to have these facilities in Wakama bear my name, as we are, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is a place where 4 generations of the Calvert family, his children, his grandchildren, have learned about life and have learned about God's creation. And I certainly can't think of anything more meaningful to say about it than that. So once again, I want to thank Lauren and Betty for being here today. I thank them both for their service to this province, a province that they both love. And I want to congratulate them today on what is their day and is a very, very well-deserved honour, the naming of the Lauren Calvert Campground and the Lauren Calvert Loop. Thank you.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, it is truly a good day when we can honour someone of the calibre of Mr. Lorne Calvert, our 13th Premier. A Premier who brought to his role a philosophy to become a have province with heart. I think that sums up exactly what the Calvert legacy is. And I looked back at some of the milestones that occurred, and that philosophy was further elaborated when he said, there can be no social progress without economic progress. We might have heard that message a few times, but it's a pretty important one. He understood that in order to fuel the way we care for each other, we need to make sure that we've got an economy that's giving everyone an opportunity to thrive, an economy that grows. And that's exactly what he helped to oversee. Now, he was part of that Romano government that had to clean up the terrible mess left by divine Conservatives, but he had a chance after that to be part of an exciting moment, a boom. And let's talk about that boom. Under this Premier, Saskatchewan's population grew to over 1 million people. People were staying and people were returning. Saskatchewan's economy was booming. He delivered 6 balanced budgets in 6 years. That's more than the Sask Party's delivered in over a dozen. He had the lowest unemployment rate in the entire country. Over $1.8 billion left in a rainy day fund. That might be one regret, is leaving that to the government opposite, what they chose to do with it, but that's for another story. Under him, Saskatchewan became a have province. And I want to quote someone who summarized this the best. Excuse me. I'll say a quote from a member who's no longer on the opposite side, but was there for some time. Mr. Bradwell said, in regards to Mr. Calvert's economic record, he said, those changes that have set the table for the feast we are grateful for today, those changes were made by the government of Mr. Calvert. I'm really glad to hear those words, because so often in this House, the record of Mr. Calvert isn't given the respect that it should receive, that it deserves. The record of setting the stage and bringing into being an incredible boom in this province. But the thing is, he wasn't content with setting the table. He wasn't content with just a feast. He wanted to make sure that everyone was invited to partake in that feast. There should be no economic progress without social progress, is what the Premier had to say. He made sure that that economic progress translated into a better life for Saskatchewan people. A universal seniors drug plan, shorter wait times for surgeries, for diagnostic procedures, benefits for vulnerable workers, a higher minimum wage, thousands of new training spaces, more affordable tuition, large infrastructure investments, new relationships with First Nations and Métis people. The Premier who visited every reserve in the province. Real growth in childcare, in early learning, real growth in housing, and real progress on a green agenda. This is a Premier who did all of those things in a very challenging time. 4 years of drought, oil prices down in the $20 to $30 a barrel much of the time, border issues, national challenges, managed to achieve this much in those 6 years. So it is very fitting that we recognize his legacy today, and it's very fitting that we see the choice of what was chosen to be named for Mr. Calvert. And I applaud the government for this choice. I think it's very appropriate. The Lorne Calvert Campground in the River Park in the Waccamaw Valley. It's perfect. This Premier has spent more time, he and Betty, than any Premier before or since in Saskatchewan campgrounds. When they were first married, they started touring around the province in a converted school bus, and buses have become kind of a thing for Mr. Calvert over the years. I remember running into him a couple times out on Avenue E, out tinkering with an old bus he'd bought and was converting to a camper. He toured as Premier, his annual summer bus tours, touring around to small towns all over the province, making sure he connected with people in every corner of the province. And I think when we brought back an STC bus during the last campaign, he was kind of mad we didn't ask him to come drive it for a couple days. But Waccamaw in particular, a Moose Jaw boy who grew up swimming at the beach, canoeing in the river, sledding on the hills, wandering the trails. I think there might even have been some moments of misspent youth in the Waccamaw Park as well. What a perfect spot to honor this Premier and his legacy, and I'm so happy that we will have the Calvert Campground, the Lorne Loop, and that Moose Jaw people and visitors to that fine city will have a chance to enjoy that beautiful part of our province and to remember the legacy of Premier Lorne Calvert for years and years to come.
Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, Honourable Mr. Wyatt.
I recognize.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 67, the Emergency Planning Act number 2, introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 67 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister. Next city.
Item number 2, Honourable Mr. Wyatt.
I recognize the Justice Minister.
Move that Bill number 68, the Enforcement of Maintenance Orders Amendment Act 2021, a bilingual bill, be now read and introduced the first time.
It has been moved by the Justice Minister that Bill number 68 be now introduced and read a first time. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? Justice Minister. City.
Item number 3, Honourable Mr. Wyatt.
I recognize the Justice Minister.
69, Jurisdictional Support Orders Amendment Act 2021, a bilingual bill, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Justice Minister that Bill number 69 be now introduced and read a first time. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Justice Minister.
Next sitting of the Legislature, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Item number 4, Honourable Mr. Harrison Meadowlake.
I recognize the Minister of Corrections and Policing.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 70, the Legislative Assembly Amendment Act 2021, bilingual bill, be now introduced and read a first time.
The Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety, that Bill number 70 be now introduced and read a first time. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing on special committees. Before orders of the day, I'd like to reply to the points of order. On November 22nd, 2021, the Government House Leader raised a point of order stating that Bill number 606, the Saskatchewan Employment Paid Sick Days Amendment Act 2021, be struck from the order paper for lack of a royal recommendation. He cited Rule 67 of the Rules and Procedures of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, which states in part that any bill which proposes to impose any new or additional charge upon the public revenue or the people must first be recommended to the Assembly by the Lieutenant Governor prior to the motion for second reading. Bill number 606 was introduced by the member for Saskatoon University on November 15, 2021. As is the case with every bill, Bill 606 was reviewed in accordance with Rule 67 for the financial implications prior to the motion for second reading. As the bill was found to have no financial implications, the member of Saskatoon University was allowed to move second reading on November 18th. In this point of order, the Government House Leader argues that Bill 606 would in fact require significant expenditure of public funds, a fact he said was evident from the member of Saskatoon University's second reading speech. He stated on page 1267 of Hansard, and I quote, "Allowing this bill to be called to a vote would set an alarming precedent that public members may introduce, speak to, and attempt to pass bills that require a royal recommendation," end quote. As such, I have undertaken to re-examine the provisions in the bill to see if it would indeed create an obligation on the public purse through its implementation, as the Government House Leader contends. The Opposition House Leader argues that no public spending is proposed in Bill 606, and she pointed out that other bills with similar provisions would have allowed to proceed through this Assembly without royal recommendation. She cited Bill 604, introduced by a private member in 2007, as an example. This bill, in fact, was reintroduced in 2018, later voluntarily removed from the order paper on May 13, 2019, when a similar government bill, Bill number 172, the Saskatchewan Employment, Paid Interpersonal Violence and Sexual Violence Leave Amendment Act 2019, proceeded unanimously through all stages in a single day. All three of these bills proposed to allot 5 days paid leave per year to employees experiencing interpersonal or sexual violence, but they were deemed not to impose new financial implications because the public service employees were already entitled to paid pressing necessity leave under the public service regulations. In terms of any financial obligation imposed on the government through Bill 606, the statutory authorization for expenditures of the funds in question already exists. The Public Service Commission currently has the ability to make regulations governing paid sick and special leave and other allowances for government employees under Section 14(1)D of the Public Service Act 1998. The Government House Leader contends that Bill 606 requires a royal recommendation. On page 1267 of Hansard, the Government House Leader argued that the member for Saskatoon University, quote, plainly intends for the bill to compel the provincial government to fund paid sick leave through a variety of means, all of which would create a fiscal liability, end quote. My role is to look at the bill's contents to determine whether the bill itself is in order. According to Erskine's May 24th edition, page 564, the scope of a bill represents the reasonable limits of its collective purposes as defined by its existing clauses and schedules. The clauses of this bill contain no provision that, if passed, would require additional government spending. Bouchane's Parliamentary Rules and Forms 6th edition adds to this sentiment in paragraph 613, quote, a bill which does not involve a direct expenditure but merely confers upon the government a power for the exercise of which public money will have to be voted by Parliament is not a money bill, and no royal recommendation is necessary as a precedent for its introduction, end quote. After re-examining the bill, it is my conclusion that the bill creates no additional fiscal liability, even though the opposition may call on the government to go beyond the scope of its own bill. The opposition's role is to provide alternatives to the government through debate, whether that be in terms of policy or in terms of government spending. In no way is the government then obligated to act on the alternatives stated in debate here and elsewhere. The government is free to raise its concerns and further its own arguments through debate as to why the bill should be voted down. The Speaker's concern is the content of the bill itself and not remarks made in debate. I therefore find that Bill 606 is in order, and the government's House Leader's point of order is not well taken. The second point of order, on Monday, November 22nd, 2021, the opposition House Leader raised a point of order about comments made by the member from Kindersley during statements by members. The opposition House Leader indicated, quote, "You can't do something indirectly that you can't do directly," end quote. And he asked the member to withdraw and apologize. I've reviewed the record and I'm now prepared to rule on the matter. The statement in question can be found on page 1261 of Hansard, where the member from Kindersley stated, and I quote, that same member from Regina Elphinstone Centre claimed that the oil sands are a bleeping nightmare, end quote. The member indicated the adjective used before calling the oil sands a nightmare was unparliamentary, but did not repeat it. In fact, the member used the term bleeping instead of the actual word used in the quote, which would have been unparliamentary. Consequently, there was no violation of Rule 47(2)(1) by the member from Kindersley because he refrained from the use of offensive language. Therefore, I find that this point of order is not well taken. Orders of the day.
Written questions. Question number 7, asked by Ms. Wilson.
I recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the answer to question 7.
Question number 7 is tabled.
Second readings, item number 4. Honourable Mr. Wyant.
I recognize the Justice Minister.
I'm not sure it's a preferred amendment. That would be number 4. It's a preferred amendment. That's number that.
Stand.
Second readings, item number 1. Honourable Mr. Wyant.
Recognize the Justice Minister.
Which bill is that? Which bill is it?
Recognize the Justice Minister.
I rise today to move second reading of the Reviewable Transaction Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill will replace the current outdated laws which govern fraudulent preferences and fraudulent conveyances in Saskatchewan, namely the Fraudulent Preferences Act and the 1571 statute.
Board of Internal Economy don't place bipartisan.
Order. Justice Minister, I didn't hear what you said. Maybe just repeat it. Order. Order. I recognize the Justice Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Reviewable Transactions Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill will replace the current outdated laws which govern fraudulent preferences and conveyances in Saskatchewan, namely the Fraudulent Preferences Act and the 1571 Statute of Elizabeth. In their place, the bill will implement a new legislation that's been recommended by the Uniform Law Conference of Canada and further adopted to Saskatchewan law by the Law Reform Commission of Saskatchewan through the work of Ronald C.C. Cumming, QC. Mr. Speaker, broadly speaking, a fraudulent Preference involves the transfer of property by a debtor to pay one creditor, which results in other creditors being unable to pay their debts fully or in part against the debtor. In general terms, a fraudulent conveyance is where a debtor transfers property to reduce their assets. This removes or reduces the ability of creditors to recover against that debtor. Current laws respecting these matters are outdated and fail to adequately address modern commercial transactions. They also have the potential to cause confusion over which statute or which legal principles may apply in any given case. The bill will introduce a modern, comprehensive set of rules to govern these transactions, which will provide clearer guidance to the courts. Mr. Speaker, there are several other improvements being made within the bill. Firstly, the existing terminology of fraud and fraudulent transactions is removed. Under certain circumstances and conditions, transactions may be reviewed where the debtor did not intend to defraud their creditors. This change balances the interests of creditors and debtors. It involves creditors to challenge transactions that have the effect of prejudicing those creditors while respecting that debtors and other parties might enter into transactions without a malicious or fraudulent intent. The transaction may be subject to review under Part 3 of the bill, where insufficient value is paid to the debtor and the debtor has become insolvent. The debtor intends to hinder creditors' ability to recover, and the debtor receives insufficient value for their transaction. Or the debtor intends to hinder creditors' ability to recover, and the person receiving the property in the transaction knew the debtor's intention. A list of factors will be provided to the court to consider when reviewing the intentions of a debtor or a person receives property from a debtor. Part 4 of the bill will apply to transactions that give an unjustified preference to one creditor over a debtor compared to other unsecured creditors. These creditor transactions may be subject to a court order if the creditor receiving the property was not dealing at arm's length with the debtor and the debtor has become insolvent. Part 5 of the bill will set out orders and remedies that the court may grant. Part 5 will expand rent relief available to claimants under the current law by setting out a wide variety of available orders, including injunctions and newly created reviewable transaction security interests. The bill reflects a careful balance between creditors' rights to challenge unlawful transactions and the protection of debtors' legitimate interests where clear rules have been followed. Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that the bill aligns reviewable transaction law with Saskatchewan's recently modernized judgment enforcement laws. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has been a leader in modernizing its commercial transaction laws by implementing statutes such as the Personal Property Security Act and the Enforcement of Money Judgments Act. Saskatchewan would continue its leading role in this area by implementing reviewable transaction legislation. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of Bill number Reviewable Transactions Act.
It has been moved that Bill number 63 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise today and enter in the debate on Bill number 63, the Reviewable Transactions Act, and I appreciate the Minister providing the summation of the changes in this legislation. From what I've understood him to say, these are changes that come largely from the Uniform Law Conference of Canada, often a body that makes recommendations to ensure that legislation across all jurisdictions are uniform, Mr. Speaker. Very important work that they do. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to want to speak to stakeholders on this legislation, those who are experts in this field, because I'm certainly not an expert in this field, and in order to facilitate that work, I'm prepared to adjourn debate now on Bill number 63.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 2, Honourable Mr. Wyatt.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Reviewable Consequential Amendment Act 2021. This bill contains consequential amendments to the bilingual legislation necessary to implement the Reviewable Transaction Act. These amendments to the Cooperatives Act 1996, the Nonprofit Corporation Act 1995 will identify that an oppression remedy may not be sought under those acts where a remedy is available under the Reviewable Transaction Act. And with that, Mr. Speaker, pleased to move second reading of the Reviewable Transaction Consequential Amendment Act.
It has been moved that Bill number 64 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize a member from Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy to rise and join in the debate on Bill number 64. As the Minister just mentioned, this piece of legislation makes consequential amendments to pieces of legislation in respect to the changes that we just discussed in Bill number 63. I have nothing further to add than what I have already put on the record in terms of my comments on that bill. In order to facilitate further discussion with stakeholders, I'm prepared to adjourn debate on Bill number 64 at this time.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government Order, second reading. Item number 3, Honourable Mr. Wyant.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of the Provincial Court Amendment Act 2021. This bill amends the Provincial Court Act 1998 to implement the recommendations of the 2020 Provincial Court Commission to presumptively set the salary of provincial court judges as a fixed percentage amount of the salary of the Court of Queen's Bench judges. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution of Canada requires that there be a regular review of judicial salaries by an independent provincial court commission, which then makes salary recommendations to the government. The most recent commission process has recently concluded, and the salaries of provincial court judges have been determined for the next 3 fiscal years based on the recommendations in the commission report. By 2022-23 fiscal year, the provincial court judge's salary will be equal to 95% of the salary of a federally appointed Court of Queen's Bench judge. The commission report also included a recommendation that the current salary determination system be changed and that the salary of a provincial court judge be set at 95% of the salary of the Court of Queen's Bench judges, barring extraordinary circumstances. Mr. Speaker, this bill will implement the recommendations in this Act. This 95% amount will be added to the Act as a presumption that will apply when future commissions are convened to make recommendations on salary and other benefits of judges. The amendments will also include a provision to deviate from this fixed 95% amount in extraordinary circumstances. These circumstances include a significant rise of 20% or more in the Consumer Price Index, a significant decrease of more than 10% in the gross domestic product of the province of Saskatchewan, or a failure to update the salary for federally appointed judges as required under the Federal Judges Act. Mr. Speaker, if extraordinary circumstances exist, the presumption of the 95% salary amount will not apply. Instead, the Commission will follow the usual process under the Act and hearing submissions from ministry officials and judges before making salary recommendations to the Government of Saskatchewan. Implementing the presumption of a fixed 95% salary amount will reduce the cost, complexity, and uncertainty of the Commission process, giving the Commission more time to resolve other matters. Mr. Speaker, the Act currently requires an independent commission to be appointed and a report to be submitted every 3 years. Now that the determination of the salary amount will be simplified by adopting the presumption of a fixed 95% amount, the Commission term will be lengthened to 4 years, which will be more efficient. The equivalent federal commission process to determine the salary of federally appointed judges is also a 4-year term. Mr. Speaker, these changes will ensure that the Provincial Court Act will continue to provide efficient remuneration process that respects the principles of judicial independence. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Provincial Court Amendment Act 2021.
It is being moved that Bill 65 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park. I recognize the Government House Leader. You have a point of order. Please state your point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm informed by colleagues on this side of the chamber that there was significant disorder in the Assembly created by the member for Regina University who made her way over to this side of the House to admonish and, I don't know if yell is the correct word, but admonish and speak to members on this side of the chamber. I would, Mr. Speaker, ask that order be maintained in the chamber and members conduct themselves with a sense of decorum. And I would remind members as well, Mr. Speaker, that they have every opportunity to ask questions from their feet during question period when they have that opportunity.
I recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't realize I was quite so fearsome. I believe the point of order is not well taken. Mr. Speaker, I'm new to the chambers, but I believe I am allowed to cross the centre, look at you, bow, and have a calm and I believe discreet conversation with any member on that side. And Mr. Speaker, a member from the government side approached me and just repeatedly said "behind the bar" at me, which not really sure what to take. And I asked for an explanation, and then seeing it escalate, I proceeded back to my side. But Mr. Speaker, the point of order is not well taken.
She's so scary, Jeremy.
Well, I'll rule on this right now. The members can cross over to one side or the other to engage in conversations with other members. I was not aware of what was said, so the point of order is not well taken. I recognize a member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise today and enter into the discussion on this bill. It's very important that the remuneration of the judiciary remains an independent, nonpartisan process to ensure the appropriate separation between the working of the judiciary and the working of government. It's very important, Mr. Speaker, to ensure the separation between those two branches, just like it's important to ensure the separation between and recognize the independence of police forces, for example, and the role of the government, Mr. Speaker, which is why we have legislation like this, which is why we have a process, a nonpartisan process to ensure the proper remuneration of judicial salaries, as we do in many other respects when we talk about the work of the justice system, Mr. Speaker. In order to facilitate further discussion on this bill, I'm prepared now to adjourn debate on this legislation.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debate. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 38, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Nippy Albright.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon-Nutana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to enter into debate on Bill number 38, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2021. This particular bill provides a new section that gives the Director of Civil Forfeiture additional powers to make preliminary orders with regard to preservation of property, disclosure, and investigations. It also requires financial institutions to disclose certain information about a person's property or assets if it is suspected that it was attained through the proceeds of crime. And then there are some new offense provisions for people that fail to disclose or mislead the director. You know, in taking a look at this bill, you know, certainly on this side of the Assembly, we are concerned about the level of crime here in Saskatchewan. Certainly, it is the case that you know, people need to know that offences and crimes are being prosecuted, and that the powers of government are clear and enable that to proceed. I guess part of my concern is that because of social inequities, there are many people in this province who become preyed upon and are brought into criminal activities, and through whether that's through organized crime and gun-related offences and so forth. And you know, as we're looking to both also sort of strengthen our prosecution legislation and enable those tools to go forward, it requires that we're also ensuring that we're preventing people from entering a life of crime in the first place. I think it was very eloquently put earlier today when we talked about our 13th Premier, Lauren Calvert, and how he saw that we wanted to make sure that we had social progress alongside of economic progress, and I'm very saddened and disappointed to see that in so many areas we've seen how those social supports have eroded over the long tenure of this current government, and and that is leading to the kinds of issues we're starting to see with criminal activity and the need for these sort of further provisions through the seizure of criminal property and so forth. I think that there's, some concerns that we'll want to be addressing as we move forward into committee to look at this bill, looking to make sure that there's been proper consultation and that we can understand more why these powers are necessary, what sort of data and information has contributed to making the case for this, and we'll want to know that these impacts and will be impacting on people's limited means to seek justice, and it's not clear to us how prevalent the issue of money laundering is in the province, but certainly as those kinds of proceeds are recovered, that the financial accrued monies are put to good use and are used to support community-based organizations, and that we don't create sort of a perverse incentive to have police going after the proceeds of crime to line the coffers of their own institutions. So I think those are just some of the concerns that we've been bringing forward on this side of the House. We want to see that there has been good rationale put forward for the amendments, and I will look to our critic to take those questions forward and ask them and ensure that we have a strong basis for this legislation. And with that, I will conclude my remarks and adjourn debate on Bill number 38.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 39, the Queen's Printer Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Bowles.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon, Newtown.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's a privilege to rise on my feet here today and speak on Bill number 39, the Queen Printer Amendment Act 2021. This bill will be making changes to the Queen Printer Act to allow for electronic publication of the Saskatchewan Gazette, which is the official publication of the Queen's Printer. Currently, the Act requires public or paper publication of the Gazette not less than twice a month, and the delay to print and mail the Gazette will now be waived, making it accessible online, and print will still be made available. So, of course, on this side of the House, we're happy to see the Gazette move into the 21st century and allow the access through online venues of gazetted information, bills, etc., and making the legislative changes accessible to everyone is, of course, of prime importance to us. And I do want to make mention of the fact that online accessibility is something, of course, that has garnered a lot of attention as we've moved through the pandemic, and certainly that kind of accessibility is not something that is equally distributed amongst all people in Saskatchewan, and our libraries play a very essential role in ensuring accessibility. It's a little bit ironic that we had a very concerted attempt by this government back in 2015, I believe it was, to defund our library system, something that was seen as not crucial or of public importance. And I think this is just a prime example of how important library services are to the people of Saskatchewan, particularly those who are underprivileged, who rely on libraries to access online services, which of course the Queen's printer would be an important example of for a functioning democracy and for people to be able to engage fully in democracy, that they have that ability to do so. And so we certainly recommend commend this modernization effort through the amendment to the Act. And I did also want to sort of point out the fact that I would like, and we would like, to see similar kinds of modernization amendments occurring to other areas of democracy here in Saskatchewan. In particular, the ability to make online petitions. Certainly we see that occurring at the federal level. Petitions are an important aspect of a functioning democracy to make sure that people are able to have a say and make their voice be heard, facilitates the process. And so while I welcome these amendments, I would suggest that it be something that we extend and see also be reflected in all areas of legislative tools and powers, and in particular with respect to online petitions. So really that's all I really wanted to say at this point on this particular bill. I'm sure that the critic will have much more to say when it goes to committee, and with that I will adjourn debate on Bill number 39.
A member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 40, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Bowes.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
The Speaker, it's a pleasure to be on my feet today to enter into adjourned debate on Bill number 40. This is the Trespass to Property Amendment Act of 2021. There's a lot of talk about how this bill is attempting to focus on deterring rural property crime. The attempts that are being made to do that, Mr. Speaker, are through increasing minimum penalties from $2,000 to $5,000 for the first offense and up to $25,000 for the second offense for repeat offenders on the same property. It introduces the possibility of imprisonment for a maximum of 6 months and a $2,000 maximum penalty for corporations that counsels or aids in the commission of an offense. Mr. Speaker, there I think is agreement that we would all like to reduce crime, we would all like to reduce rural property crime, make sure that folks feel safe on their land and feel that their property is protected. So I would hope that there are significant efforts being made by this government to really address the root causes of crime in the first place, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We know that issues like poverty, addictions, and mental health are social determinants of crime, yet there seems to be no attention to these very significant social issues across our province by this government. So, you know, agree with the intent, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but how successful is this going to be? You know, where is the evidence that increasing minimum penalties is going to lead to less offenses, Mr. Deputy Speaker? So I remain skeptical about this the ability of this bill to accomplish its goals. I think that we need to have a serious conversation in this province about how we move together, how we build each other up, and how we can significantly look at at the root causes here. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know that there will be many other of my colleagues will have more to say about this bill, in addition to questions that the critic will have in committee. With that, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill 40 for today.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 41, the Legislation Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Conway.
I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll enter in brief here with respect to Bill number 41, the Legislation Amendment Act 2021. This amends legislation to maintain consistency with other jurisdictions and to continue the ongoing modernization of legislation, is my understanding. Changes to interpreting how enactments apply to one another, such as how to define certain terms. I understand that it has been said by the minister that this will allow for more efficiency in making comprehensive, consequential amendments when several regulations are needed to be amended at once. I think this is straightforward cleaning up of legislation, modernization of legislation. Certainly, we'll engage in consultation with respect to this bill and invite any stakeholders that have an understanding of its impacts to connect at this point in time. But at this point in time, I'll adjourn debate for Bill number 41, the Legislation Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 42, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2021. Number 2, Ms. Ritchie.
I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Chair of Committees. It's my pleasure to enter in briefly with respect to Bill number 42, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2021. Again, with this piece of legislation, what we see here is some modernization and some housekeeping in the language, and we're happy to see that. We see that there's changes here as well. We're replacing references to the Minister of Community Resources and Employment with the Minister of Social Services, and removes reference to repealed legislation and implements gender-neutral language. Certainly, it's a good thing to see gender-neutral language represented. There's some, changes to the Agricultural Administration Act, and here as well, removal of livestock supplies, agricultural supplies from the revolving fund. Certainly, will engage with stakeholders on this front to make sure impact is fully understood. There's changes as well to the Global Transportation Hub Act. We're interested to learn more about how these changes will impact stakeholders, And I guess, now that we're talking about the GTH, Mr. Speaker, this is a government that has failed Saskatchewan people with any level of value for money or accountability with respect to the dollars that this government wasted without any transparency with respect to the GTH, a government that has failed to answer to Saskatchewan people in an inexcusable way on this front, that filled the pockets, Mr. Speaker, of those with close ties to the current government, donors of this government, and did so with a corrupted process, Mr. Speaker. And those are the hard-earned dollars of Saskatchewan people. Ripped off nuns, filled the pockets of donors. Saskatchewan people know how inexcusable the actions of this government are with respect to the GTH, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to fight as the official opposition with all of Saskatchewan people's interests in mind to get to the bottom of this mess, this scandal, to get the answers Saskatchewan people deserve, and then to get the value for money delivered to the maximum benefit that we can out of the dollars that have been placed, making sure that we're looking to the future on this front. But with respect to Bill number 42, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2021, I'll adjourn debate at this time. Mr. Deputy Chair of Committees.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 43, the Royal Saskatchewan Museum Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Nippy Albright.
I recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to enter in briefly to Bill number 43, the Royal Saskatchewan Museum Amendment Act 2021. I know our critics are going to be directly engaged with respect to this piece of legislation. It's critical for us to make sure that this legislation is in the long-term interests of that incredible museum, and to make sure that this legislation is as strong as it can be in supporting that very important work and that incredibly proud legacy and that collection, remarkable collection. Mr. Speaker, I want to say thank you to all that make the Royal Saskatchewan Museum so great. And I want to thank the Friends of the Royal Saskatchewan Museum and all those that work within it, the curators, the scientists, those that organize collection, those that welcome visitors. It's a remarkable place that showcases this province. We want to make sure, as Saskatchewan New Democrats, as the official opposition, that this museum has legislation that supports its long-term interests. We want to make sure that it has the resources and the revenues and the funding that supports its long-term interests. And I know one critical place that really needs attention and action and resources by this provincial government is that of the annex that houses an incredible wealth of artifact that's indisposable to our province in our ability to tell our history and share our history with the world. So I know we're all proud of this museum. I know we all frequent the museum. I know this is a place that my little guy, William, cherishes. And I love, over the years, watching him from being a little guy and watching how he engages with the exhibits and how that's changed as he's growing. And it's a remarkable place to learn about our province and to celebrate our province as well. But what I would want to clearly make sure is on the record is that the official opposition will support legislation that improves support for the museum now and into the future. So our critic will be engaged on this front. We'll be looking to improve legislation wherever possible, and we'll be pushing for the support that that museum deserves, particular to the concern around the old annex that quite simply has been outgrown a long time ago, and the importance of us protecting that artifact and that history and making sure it's there for generations to come to tell the story of this province. So thank you to all that make this museum such an incredible place. All that team, all that staff, all the directors, the friends of the museum, the patrons of the museum, the members of the museum. Our family is proud to be a family member of that museum as well. It's a real important place to this province, and it needs better support at this critical time from this government. At this point in time, I'll adjourn debate with respect to Bill number 43, the Royal Saskatchewan Museum Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 7, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 44, the Corporation Capital Tax Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Beck.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Miigwech, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to offer my initial comments on Bill number 44, the Corporation Capital Tax Amendment Act 2021. So this bill is proposing some changes on updating the names from department to the appropriate name of ministry, and also provides a definition of a resource corporation is amended to include associated corporations and affiliated person. This is to include both corporations and affiliated persons are subject to the resource surcharge. And also the purpose of this bill, this amendment, is to level the playing field and to protect the revenue base. It's important that we modernize the language that we use and update so that we can be relevant. And so it's good to see that amendments are being made to modernize the language. And there's some aspects of this bill that the public will find interesting, and I would hope that stakeholders will be engaged in a meaningful way regarding this bill. So some small businesses are the economic engine of Saskatchewan, and we need to ensure that they are supported with any legislation about corporations. We've heard a lot of talk about from constituents and citizens in this province around the PST, the tax on food, and it's making it really more difficult for families to go out and enjoy an outing of food without that, and then they have to pay that additional tax. So it's making, I think, for those of us that are elected in these positions, we have to always be thinking about what's in the best interest of the folks that we serve, those that elected us, and what's in the best interest of our folks here. And I find it quite interesting that there's some great discussions and some giggles happening over here. And obviously they find this bill number 44 quite amusing. That's, it's quite riveting. So I won't say much more on this. I'm sure the critic for this portfolio would have much more to say. So I would like to, having said that, I am in favor of moving this along. And so, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 44, the Corporation Capital Tax Amendment Act 2021. Miigwech.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 8, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 45, the Health Shared Services Saskatchewan 3S Health Act. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Miigwech, Deputy Speaker. Again, I'm rising again to speak on Bill number 45, the Health Shared Services Saskatchewan 3S Act of 2021. And again, this legislation is updating the 3S Health. The Act authorizes the relationship between the Ministry of Health, the Saskatchewan Health Authority, and the 3S Health. It's also transferring responsibility and accountability to the ministry. And the Act updates the 3S Health mandate, the governance and structure and accountability to the ministry. The 3S Health will also continue to but it will become a public agency subject to the Financial Administration Act. Now, it's important that we update our legislation, and this bill is housekeeping updates in this legislation. And it's centralizing and improving standards for health care is always a welcome. And oversight and accountability being transferred to the ministry is also welcoming, I would say. But we must keep an eye out for any indication of privatization. When I think about this, one thing that, before I read the bill, one of the things that I raised last year and still today has not ever been addressed is when it comes to the Saskatchewan Health card for First Nation registered Indians. There's still the R there, you know, and that R stands for registered Indian. And that R is discriminatory in nature. It's a racist, it's racism against registered Indians. And when I think about, you know, the shared health services here in Saskatchewan and how we are trying to streamline and improve standards of care, I think that piece is something that I know that constituents, stakeholders are very, in particular First Nations, are very interested in that piece. But I won't say much more about this other than the other thing is around privatization. You know, I certainly hope that we are keeping our eyes open when it comes to privatization, and that we don't penalize our citizens and have a two-tier system. So I won't speak much more. I'm sure the critic for this area would also have more questions in committees and in the committee and ask these questions that are being brought forth from the citizens of this province. And so with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would move we adjourn debate on Bill number 45, the Health Shared Services Saskatchewan 3S Act 2021. Miigwech.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 9, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 46, the Legal Aid Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Ritchie.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Miigwech, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to be on my feet again to speak to this Bill number 46, the Legal Aid Amendment Act 2021. So again, this is modernizing and doing some housekeeping and changing from solicitor to lawyer, department to ministry, etc. And of course, it's confirming the powers of the Legal Aid Commission. The CEO of Legal Aid will now confirm or deny any lawyer that wishes to withdraw services to a client. So the need for legal aid services continues to grow and is crucial to providing representation to those with limited means. Not a corresponding influx in their funding, government's needs ensure it's adequately funded. You know, when I think about legal aid, I think back of who gets these services and who doesn't. You know, I think back to when my daughter, who was working full-time and was a mother of 3 children and had to leave her abusive relationship. And she was working full-time. And she had to flee from that abusive relationship. And she wanted to ensure that she had custody of her little babies. And she didn't meet that threshold to access legal aid because she was working. She had to quit her job and go on welfare. And I thought, wow, she is fleeing a domestic violent situation. She is working to provide for her babies. And she had to quit her job to access legal aid. And the thing that was really upsetting and disconcerting was that because of the overworked legal aid office, it took a long, long time for her to have interim custody of her babies. And the other thing that was really disconcerting is how we penalize those that are struggling. And I use this as an example, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because before this happened, I made the assumption that legal aid is available for those that cannot afford a lawyer to represent them. But what we found was that my daughter did not meet that threshold. The other thing I found was because there's not enough lawyers available to represent people, that it was hard to represent the folks that they're representing in a meaningful, effective way. And I think about the challenges my daughter had in the legal aid system. The challenge of reaching her lawyer who was representing her, I don't know, the lawyer had a lot of other clients as well, and my daughter had trouble getting what she needed done in a timely way. And when calls were not being addressed, her concerns weren't being addressed. And I informed her, I advised her, if you're not getting the services that you need under these public funded systems, go and talk to the ombudsman. So what happened was, and this is my daughter, her lawyer, the supervisor for my daughter's lawyer was they were a married couple. And I thought, isn't there a conflict of interest here? And in that situation, how many vulnerable people have issues with the legal system accessing it that's effective for them and that will work for them without coming up with these conflict of interest situations? And my daughter risked being turned away and services being withdrawn if she pursued a complaint. So when I think about how we need more lawyers to be here, and the process that we have currently about the red tape, we have to change that. We have to be more effective and responsive to those that need those services. You know, I use my daughter as an example. Things worked out for her, but it was a long, long process. You know, and with her pride, she wouldn't allow her parents to help her. You know, but anyway, when I think of that, I think of how many people that are struggling, that want legal representation, but can't because they do not meet that threshold. I know this is not a sexy topic for any of you guys to hear. You know, I know you're looking around and there's great stuff up on the ceiling there, but this is important. This is important. We are here as legislators, as representatives, to best serve those that do not have the means nor the capacity to help themselves. And we have to be here to do the best for the people, even the ones that don't vote for us, but the people that are vulnerable, the ones that have been intentionally ignored for so long. We have to represent them. And we have to speak for them. And I use a lot of my own personal experience here in this House. And I will not apologize for that, because we need representation in this House. We need people in this House standing in my role where I am at to talk about what is actually happening out there. So having said that, I won't say anything more, and I'm sure the critic will have much more to say on this, and my other colleagues. But with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 46, the Legal Aid Amendment Act 2021. Miigwech.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 47, the Highways and Transportation Amendment Act 2021. Mr. Love.
I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it is to rise this afternoon and enter into the second reading debate on Bill number 47, the Highways and Transportation Amendment Act 2021. As I mentioned the last time I was up on second readings, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think we all prepare differently for second reading debates, but one of the things that I try to think about is the reasons why we're seeing the bill that's in front of us, why now, who's been consulted, who's asking for this change, who's impacted, and so on. So in the minister's entry on November the 10th, some of that was outlined as to the background for the reasons we see the bill in front of us. There's a bit of a theme with some of the legislation we see here. This one talks about removing regulatory burdens and costs like the unnecessary license fees for auto wreckers. Mr. Deputy Speaker, not something that I've heard in my capacity, but something that obviously has been brought forward in some circles, so that's an interesting piece there. One of the other pieces that's noted in this speech is the importance of maintaining a collection of vehicle identification numbers, something that I in earnest thought that we did already, the collection of VIN numbers, but I'm sure that there will be questions there. One of the more interesting phrases in the legislation and in the minister's second reading speech was the freedom of passage provisions, which ensure that there is consultation before any municipality were to shut down a highway. So I would assume, as you do in many of these specific instances, that there must be a story behind this in a case where there was some concern about a municipality shutting down a highway without either proper consultation, or that there was a concern brought to the Minister of Highways on this issue. So, those are the sort of things that when we're looking at the bills and when the critic is meeting with stakeholders, that they will seek to find clarity on. Perhaps they already have on why we see that. Some updating of technology, commercial vehicle enforcement, updating that technology, Mr. Deputy Speaker, which sounds interesting, and I'm sure there will be more questions about that and many more. But I don't know that it is doing anything to further the clarity on this bill at this point, so I think I will conclude my remarks on Bill number 47 and move to adjourn debate.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 11, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 49, Saskatchewan Gaming Corporation Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Young, Regina University.
I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I rise again to enter into second reading debates at this time on Bill number 49, an act to amend the Saskatchewan Gaming Corporation Act. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a bill that I'm sure members in this House will be familiar with, or at least there was a news conference when this was announced, when this agreement, framework agreement was announced, and some media around this substantive change, really. This bill, which creates the ability for revenue sharing between the Government of Saskatchewan and the First Nations Trust, a 50-50 revenue sharing agreement, and I think that there was celebration by all parties involved in this announcement, and certainly has been labeled as a first step to reconciliation or economic reconciliation. Some of the background information that I've read and we've heard in the media, and certainly that is something that is incredibly important to this province, both today and as we move forward together. And you know, so a first step is important, Mr. Speaker. Of course, a first step when we have many steps to go doesn't quite get us there. So I would hope that there would be the same earnesty on the part of this government and willingness to look at other ways to really move the markers on reconciliation, economic reconciliation, looking at things like the differences in living conditions, the learning gap in education, and so many other things, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that are truly important to everyone in this province. I'm not meaning to go long on this, but you know, I was struck when we were sitting here with Mr. Calvert, Premier Calvert, in the gallery, and the comments around the importance of social progress going hand in hand with economic progress. And too often those are set as if they're a dichotomy, one or the other, Mr. Speaker. And I think the answer really has to be both. And certainly with regard to next steps and reconciliation, that has to come with economic reconciliation, with self-governance, with independence of decision-making. And, you know, we've seen this step, which I think is appreciated. We also hear my colleague from Saskatoon Centre rise day after day and talk about the very large issues with duty to consult, for example. So I will leave that here to say it is good to see first steps. We've got a lot of steps to make up in this province, so I hope that we see that in quick order. But with that, I will conclude my remarks, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and move to adjourn debate on Bill number 49.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 12, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 50, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2021.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and enter into debate on Bill number 50, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2021. This bill is going to be providing the authority to immediately suspend drivers' licenses and impound vehicles for drivers charged with stunting, racing, or excessive speed. And a couple other significant improvements meant to provide added clarity around allowing suspended drivers to legally partake in driver evaluations while in the company of an authorized driver instructor, and also brings all road signs, including municipal speed and road signs, into the legislation, and all road signs will be considered lawful. I think it's. I think these are, reasonable improvements that we're seeing to address improved traffic safety, bring added clarity around the application, and ensure that when traffic violations go before a judge, that they can be successfully prosecuted, and that we are addressing a very disturbing recent phenomenon with regards to the increase in stunting, racing, and excessive speed that we've seen occurring over the last number of years here in Saskatchewan. Obviously, it's been a bit curious to see such a development happening during a pandemic. One can only assume that with more people off the roads and perhaps those with a little more time on their hands, they've taken to this kind of reckless, irresponsible behavior in the form of stunt driving, and that definitely we want to make sure that we're sending clear signals discouraging that kind of unacceptable behavior. I did make note of the fact that we were seeing reports by police, by the RCMP on Twitter and other social media around the high prevalence and the high speeds that some of these reckless drivers were using on our road and transportation system, and the need to be addressing that, highlighted and improve upon the powers for police to apprehend and impound vehicles, and send a clear message that this kind of behavior is reckless and unacceptable. I think those are good initiatives. I know certainly within the city of Saskatoon and in the constituency of Saskatoon-Nutana, we'd had some very disturbing cases of pedestrians who were put at risk and indeed lost their lives due to excessive speeds on urban roads, and it's really unfortunate and disturbing that pedestrians, people who are trying to enjoy, say, an early morning walk, to get exercise and move freely within their community, would then be the victims of this kind of reckless behavior. And I know that that's had direct impact on people in my constituency, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and bring that forward here today. I also wanted to mention the fact that, as we're debating the amendments to this act, that it's also happening at a time when we saw the terrible, terrible consequences of the lack of adherence to road safety signs that led to the terrible tragedy of the Humboldt's Bronco crash back in 2017, and that was recently in the news in the past day with respect to whether or not the driver of that semi-truck trailer was going to be deported, given his status as resident in Canada and therefore with a criminal conviction being deported. I mean, certainly it really highlights the importance of safety on our road system across the province, and we access roads to, as I mentioned when I was debating the bill number 47, that you know, our roads are our lifeline. They are what connect us community to community, family to family, and allow for commercial trade to occur, and they contribute to both social progress and economic progress here in Saskatchewan. But it does, to me, seem a little bit disproportionate at times, the amount of attention we give to our road systems, while at the same time ignoring other equally important areas of policy here in Saskatchewan. And I look at it a bit through a gendered lens. It's great to you know, have the ability to travel freely across the province, have a personal vehicle, if we're so fortunate to be able to afford one, and drive on safe roads, that potholes are being filled, certainly, and days gone by for those of a certain generation will of course recall how much fodder was made out of, you know, potholes here in Saskatchewan compared to Alberta. I'll leave it at that, but certainly it's been quite a topic of debate over the years, the state of our roads in Saskatchewan, of course the importance of safety, no matter if you're traveling on a bus, as was the case for the Broncos hockey team, a sports team. My children as well, of course, many a time have had the privilege of being part of sports teams that took buses across this province, traveled to other provinces to play their sports, and I always felt confident that they were safe, that they would reach their destination, and just how privileged they were to be able to do that. But yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that there are a lot of people who aren't quite so privileged to be able to travel freely on our road systems, and particularly with the demise of the Saskatchewan Transportation Corporation undertaken by this Sask Party government has led to the freedoms of Saskatchewan people being limited by their inability to travel across the province. And so while I welcome measures to increase safety, increase certainty around the prosecution of driving offences, that we simply aren't doing enough to ensure that all Saskatchewan citizens can travel freely and safely across this great province. I think in particular, and I've mentioned this before, I think about my mother, who, you know, took advantage of a SDI promotion to retire her vehicle and get an STC bus pass so that she could, as an elderly person, more safely travel to visit family and friends, whether that was in Moose Jaw or Yorkton, Melfort, we have family across this province, and she's no longer able to travel freely as she did when she first retired her vehicle. She's elderly, she's over 80 years old, and now she's at the mercy of family to be able to, you know, take her to visit family, and it's really quite upsetting that she isn't able to do that as frequently anymore. She used to enjoy going to the Festival of Words in Moose Jaw, She enjoyed going to Yorkton to visit family every summer and travel to the places that she grew up doing her youth. And so when we talk about safety and the purpose of these amendments to ensure that we're improving safety, I think that we need to be thinking about it in this broader context. Not only just for seniors, but then of course there's lots of concern highlighted around now the prevalence of people having to hitchhike to access remote communities, northern communities, and particularly how dangerous that was for women. And so while it's great to drive big personal vehicles and ensure that we're safe doing that, and obviously as MLAs here, we travel from right across the province to reach the legislature, and we want to be able to do that safely, but there's so many people here in Saskatchewan that don't have that same opportunity, who are underprivileged, who also are having their other benefits cut and slashed. So when we think about social progress, I think that there is far, far more we could be doing to ensure a more equal just society here in the great province of Saskatchewan. I think about things like the petition to bring in paid sick leave, a living wage here in the province. You know, we've got these incremental increases to our minimum wage that don't go anywhere near addressing issues of providing a safe, livable wage for all Saskatchewan people. I think about the other measures we've brought forward in this session around access to midwifery services, abortion services, in vitro fertilization, and so if we're really serious about safety, then I think we need to be making sure that we're doing more than just being focused on highway safety. And I would say that these are the kinds of things that when you have a government that is underrepresented from marginalized populations, from having a gender diverse caucus, you're missing out on seeing what the real issues are for Saskatchewan people. And as I said at the start, I'm not saying that it's not good to be ensuring safety of our roads, but it's not sufficient. And there are more other areas that we need to be focused on. And I think there's just maybe perhaps one final thing I wanted to mention, but yes, I will leave with this final thought, and I guess what I find particularly ironic with this is that roadways and access to personal vehicles ensure that we have, you know, independence, and we can exercise our personal choice. And certainly it's interesting that these amendments are doing things that you know, are imposing safety constraints on those who wish to undertake reckless behavior within their driving habits. And when it comes to COVID, I don't see the same due consideration in terms of ensuring that we're protecting public safety, broadly speaking, in all areas of governmental policy. And that's something that we've really been trying to sort of make the point on throughout this session. So I'm sure that our critic will have far more to say on this bill and when it goes to committee, as well as my learned colleagues on this side of the House. So with that, I will adjourn debate on Bill number 50, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item 13, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 51. Ms. Young, Regina University.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to join in debate on Bill number 51, the Privacy Intimate Images Additional Remedies Amendment Act 2021. I understand that a tort was created back in 2019 to address the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, or what is colloquially referred to as revenge porn. And this bill brings about amendments so that not only the distribution but the threatened distribution of intimate images is a tort, and the bill also expands some of the remedies available, requiring individuals that distribute such images to make all reasonable efforts to make the images unavailable through various means. No doubt this activity does present unique challenges because it usually takes place on the internet. And I know that the critic in the area will have questions in committee about whether the bill has turned its mind sufficiently to that reality. As we all know in this House, the impacts of the non-consensual distribution of intimate images can have quite tragic impacts. We've heard of high-profile cases of suicide, extreme mental health impacts, and of course we know that the victims of these acts are vastly disproportionately women. So the main question I have around this bill is, given the challenges with addressing these acts when they've taken place, the horse is a bit out of the barn by then, it's difficult to recall some of these images. What is this government doing to prevent this kind of activity? Of course, this kind of thing takes place in a highly toxic culture around sexuality and gender roles, and I don't know of anything the government is doing in terms of outreach and education around this very important issue. We know that this is happening increasingly often, and when we're talking about something like this, prevention is key. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I don't have much more to add. I know that the justice critic, will reach out to stakeholders and will have questions about this legislation in committee. And with that, it is my pleasure to adjourn debate on Bill number 51, the Privacy Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 14, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 52, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to engage in debate on Bill number 52, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2021. I understand this is quite a straightforward housekeeping bill. It requires individuals to maintain insurance while suspended and participating in various things like training, road tests, or driver assessments. Unlike the Sask Party government's tax on electric vehicles, a tax that won't even pay for itself, Mr. Speaker, this particular piece of vehicle-related policy appears to be a common-sense change, and I know our critic will bring any substantive concerns to the fore in committee. So with that, it is my pleasure to adjourn debate on Bill number 52, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2021.
Members move to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Orders, adjourn debates. Item 15, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 53, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2021. Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise today and enter the debate around Bill number 53. And Mr. Speaker, this is fairly standard housekeeping bill, obviously focused on repealing old and unused legislation, although in preparing for it, it did give me the opportunity to look into what the Sisters of St. Martha is seen as this is being repealed by this piece of legislation. So I do appreciate that opportunity. And Mr. Speaker, I know the government has worked to ensure that all impacted ministries by this are not going to be negatively impacted. And I want to recognize the people who work very hard in drafting legislation and ensuring its consistency across all ministries. So with that, Mr. Speaker, in order to facilitate the discussion, I am prepared to now move to adjourn debate on Bill number 53.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the House to adopt Assembly. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item 16, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 54, the Miscellaneous Statute Remote Witnessing Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Sarb.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate today on Bill number 54, the Miscellaneous Statutes Remote Witnessing Act 2021. This bill aims to amend 3 acts which will allow lawyers to witness powers of attorney, wills, and healthcare directives remotely via electronic means. It's my understanding that many practices were brought in during the pandemic that have become more commonplace. It certainly seems as though these would increase access to justice. I think about the fact that we're in the year 2021, and I remember most recently when I renewed my mortgage, I was able to sign electronically. It was still through an additional human being who was present to witness it, but if I can take on a 25-year mortgage electronically, it certainly seems appropriate that we can put measures in place to allow lawyers to do their work electronically as well. We definitely want to make sure that there are no unintended consequences to this legislation, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting that these practices are being codified despite the fact that hopefully at some point this pandemic will end. So it would be interesting to see what the long-term plan is in terms of the evolution of the law, but there have certainly been a number of changes over the past year, and I think we are witnessing a bit of an evolution in this area, Mr. Speaker. So, a fan of anything that will improve access to justice will want to go through this with a fine-tooth comb, and I know that the critic will want to engage in committee, but with that, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 54.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item 17, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 55, the Miscellaneous Statute Remote Witnessing Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Sarb.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It is my pleasure to be on my feet to engage in debate on Bill number 55, the Miscellaneous Statutes Remote Witnessing Amendment Act 2021, number 2. This bill contains some pretty straightforward but also significant changes in terms of its impact on the legal system and the legal community. It includes electronic witnessing of documents, wills, and power of attorney, the like. Certainly, the feedback I've received from my colleagues in the legal field has been overwhelmingly positive when this change was brought about due to the pandemic. Indeed, the pandemic has exposed what was already quite apparent to most, that our legal system functions on an antiquated basis oftentimes, and changes have been slow around electronic court documents, and virtual hearings, despite the fact that these changes are welcomed by many. I will just say, Mr. Speaker, that simplified procedures are important. Well-resourced technological changes to increase efficiency are important within the justice system, but we always have to make these changes with a view to assisting under-resourced and self-represented folks. As we know, these people are on a huge rise in our justice system, unfortunately, and it has put a strain on access to justice. So, you know, I would compel this government to look at every possible means to address the increased efficiencies within the legal system, always with an eye to improving access to justice, and always with careful consideration that the efficiencies that we identify don't undermine the rights of justice and legal system participants. These are important changes. It's a shame that they had to be born out of a pandemic, but it's good to see that this is going to be a permanent change, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Changes such as this, no doubt, will increase confidence in the legal system. So with that, it is a pleasure to leave it at that. I know my critic will have more to say on this bill in committee. And with that, I will move to adjourn debate on Bill number 55, the Miscellaneous Statutes Remote Witnessing Amendment Act 2021, number 2.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Resume debate on the second reading for motion for Bill number 56, the Queen's Bench Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Saar.
Recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise again this afternoon to enter into second reading debates on this Bill number 56, the Queen's Bench Amendment Act 2021. I think I will keep my comments fairly brief, Mr. Speaker, but there are some things that I would like to note, less perhaps with the bill itself, which appears to be really of a housekeeping nature for the most part, updating language, updating the legislation to reflect the current practice with regard to the number of judges currently practicing. So just updating that. But I will also note, as I have, Mr. Speaker, you know, the importance when the minister is introducing this bill of introducing why we're seeing this bill, why now, and I note my colleagues, the critics' report here, acknowledging that the details of that she is requiring, you know, have been in large part presented by the minister, and I think that that type of cooperation and understanding, oversight of the bills is really important. And you know, I know I sound like a broken record, but those questions of why we're seeing this bill now, we all have a role to play in this assembly, so that oversight, understanding. I know often when we're sitting late on bills, it does seem that this is somehow, you know, a rote exercise that we're going through, but this is really an important democratic process, the oversight of these bills. And for all members, private members here on both sides, you know, should at least be asking those questions: why we're seeing it, who was consulted, does this meet the needs of the people of Saskatchewan, which we are all ultimately here to serve, Mr. Speaker. So, you know, it's not, certainly I understand that it is the members of opposition who stand up and ask these questions, put these comments on the record publicly. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us here in this assembly to be at least asking those questions, whether, you know, that's privately when we're private members, and making sure that, you know, the needs of your constituents, the needs of the people of the province, not just a select few, but the needs of all people in this province are being served, and you have an understanding why legislation makes its way to the floor of this assembly. With that, Mr. Speaker, I know that there will be information provided, has been, and then our critic will do her due diligence, which I appreciate. But I will conclude my remarks there on this Bill number 56. I move to adjourn debate.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item 19, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 57, the Land Titles Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Saar.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to be on my feet to enter into debate on Bill number 57, the Land Titles Amendment Act 2021. I did take time to review the legislation, review some comments from my colleagues in opposition as well as those of the ministers who presented this bill for second reading. And there's a few interesting things here, I think, Mr. Speaker, that I'll continue to listen to. I will alert the Assembly that my comments will be brief today, as I think that there's still much to listen to as we continue to debate this and see it move throughout the process. If there's one thing that I do just want to maybe make a brief comment on, though, Mr. Speaker, is that when the minister was speaking to this bill, and actually throughout the amendments in this legislation, the word balance is used several times, and I just want to put on the record that this government's ability to balance is certainly in question now, as they claim to have balanced their approach to COVID. And so the meaning of that word seems to be lost on this government as we have the worst COVID death rate in the country and the worst jobs record in the country. So to hear a minister talk about presenting a bill that will bring balance, I worry about what kind of balance that might look like based on their track record of leading this province. With that, though, Mr. Speaker, I will just say one other thing. Like many other bills that we've seen in this session, the minister speaks to aligning with other jurisdictions in the country. Over and over again, we hear that. And I think, again, that just casts the words of our Premier in the really irresponsible rhetoric of nation and a nation and independence and all this stuff as really clearly exposing that was nothing more than a distraction from his failed leadership and the leadership of this government that has led us to the worst of both worlds. When we really see what they're up to here, it's aligning with other jurisdictions. That's a good thing to make sure that we are not alone within the country of Canada doing things in ways that don't align with other places. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I will conclude. I'll be watching this bill as it proceeds through the process and listen to my colleagues, but I will move that we adjourn debate on Bill 57, the Land Titles Amendment Act. Thank you.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 20, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 58, the Securities Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Saar.
Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise and enter into debate on Bill number 58. As has been noted by my colleague from Regina Douglas Park, as well as the minister, there are several changes included in this piece of legislation. The two that I'd like to touch briefly on today are the positive outcome that my colleague from Regina Elphinstone Centre has spoken about in regards to another bill as it relates to the ongoing modernization of electronic filing and this reduction in an administrative burden and red tape, as well as increased access, is a positive, and I do look forward to this continuing, keeping those principles in mind. In addition, as was noted, this bill will clarify and ensure that making false promotional activities are banned, including the sharing of the value of an investment as part of a promotion, and these are important changes being made to the contravention of security laws here in the province. Mr. Speaker, there's not a great deal to canvass here that will not be discussed by the critic, of course, after consultations with stakeholders. So With that, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to additional feedback and opportunities that will undoubtedly be taken by the critic to more broadly share concerns about online misinformation and false advertising. With that, Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate on Bill number 58, the Securities Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
From orders, adjourn debates. Item number 21, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 59, the Justice of the Peace Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Saar.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to rise today and enter some comments into the record on Bill number 59. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I'm not a lawyer, and nor do I just maintain membership with the Law Society. So I, in preparing for this, did some very intense research into establishing for myself, because I didn't know, as I'm sure most people don't, what constitutes the duties of the Justice of the Peace. And you know, Mr. Speaker, when I was looking at this legislation, one of the things I was hoping to discover was that here in Saskatchewan, justices of the peace are those people who can perform marriages. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if all members in this House know, but in Alberta, I believe it was under Premier Ralph Klein, changed legislation to ensure that all members of the Legislative Assembly could, during their service and evermore, officiate marriages, which would be pretty fun, Mr. Speaker. But as I learned here in Saskatchewan, justices of the peace do not perform marriages. But you know, without being too myopic, I'd like to put that plug in to the minister for future consideration. So now that I've spoken at length on what is not contained in Bill number 59, I'll just enter a couple brief comments that have been canvassed by the critic and my colleague from Regina Douglas Park. Of course, this is going to, as we understand it, shorten the terms of the Justice of the Peace Commission from 6 years to 4 years, and create administrative justices of the peace and ensure compensation to those taking on extra administrative work. Of course, justices of the peace play a very important role in our justice system, and this, based on the bill, appears to be these appear to be good changes. And with that, I move to adjourn debate on Bill number 59, the Justices of the Peace Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 22, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 60, the Saskatchewan Employment Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Saar.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to be on my feet to enter into debate on Bill 60, the Saskatchewan Employment Amendment Act. You know, I have been following this closely. This is one that I think we're quite excited about on this side of the House. I want to take just a few minutes to share some comments on what we see here and why this is important. You know, changing the language in the Act to make sure that sexual harassment is included and described with clarity is very important, especially as it pertains to unwanted action of a sexual nature that constitutes harassment. Certainly, I think a positive step to see this included in the Employment Act, as well as looking at some of the other changes here, that it removes requirement of Labour Relations Board to exclude supervisory employees from the bargaining unit, making changes to that process. These are all good things to see. You know, and I want to just mention that I was in a meeting with some of my colleagues, with stakeholders as critic for culture and listening to folks who work in what's described as a gig economy, the creative economy, whether they be actors, models, vocalists, singers, musicians, and to see that their workplaces are places where this kind of harassment often takes place. That was really important learning for me, to listen to those stories. And I want to make an observation briefly, Mr. Speaker, about what it means for us in opposition to have a majority female caucus. And I want to just speak to the work that my colleagues do and their reputation in this province as intelligent, courageous and principled women. And I want to talk about what we've seen, the result of that. And the result of these women is that women in this province are coming to my colleagues with their concerns. They're bringing their concerns to these women. We've seen women in this province who are picking up the pieces of the failed CIS program. Women who are leaders at Camp Hope share those stories with my colleague from Elphinstone Centre. We've seen women who are 40 weeks pregnant but unable to stay with their baby, soon to be born, come to my colleague from Regina University. We've seen women who want medical care for their kids to be covered by universal health care in this province come to my colleague from Fairview. And we've seen women who want to safely access health care services come to my colleague from Saskatoon University. So it is no surprise that women in this province who want safe workplaces, who don't want to be harassed, brought those concerns to my colleagues in opposition, where they found intelligent, capable and principled leadership to speak up for those concerns. And so I'm proud to be part of this caucus and the women that I'm surrounded by every day when I come to work. Mr. Speaker, I think that there's some really good things in this piece of legislation. I've noted a few of them. We would like to see maybe more attention to mental health in the workplace, make its way into legislation in the future, as well as extending all OH&S to all contractors and gig workers. There's a lot of folks in this province who maybe get their employment through that gig economy. They don't show up as full-time employees anywhere, but that's how they make their living, and that's important that we recognize that in legislation. I will be supporting this bill, Mr. Speaker, but I will continue to listen to my colleagues as they speak to it. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and move that we adjourn debate on Bill 60, the Saskatchewan Employment Amendment Act. Thank you.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item 23, resume debate in the second reading motion of Bill number 61, the Post-Secondary Education and Skills Training Act. Ms. Saar.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon ECU. I will recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was going to say my colleague is a good egg after that last speech, but I don't know. No, just kidding, Mr. Speaker. My colleague from Saskatoon Eastview is indeed a very good egg, and I thank him for his words. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to rise here today and enter some comments into the record on Bill number 61, the Dental Disciplines Amendment Act. And Mr. Speaker, all members in this House, I imagine, have knocked on a door or two in their time and in their journey to get to these very important seats that we hold here. And in the course of door knocking during the last election, Mr. Speaker, this very specific issue was raised with me not once, not twice, but 3 times in the constituency of Regina University. And despite the many doors that we knock on in the course of an election campaign, it is, at least in my experience, it's not particularly common to have direct advocacy on the doorstep on specific pieces of legislation being considered by the government. So it was noteworthy to me, and I think in particular the woman who I spoke to on Shannon, who was very passionate about seeing this change and seeing the ability for dental hygienists to practice independently. And it was a really interesting conversation, Mr. Speaker. It stuck with me, obviously, and I was interested to see this bill come forward. The woman that I spoke to, Mr. Speaker, spoke about the importance of dental care and the importance of dental care to health care, which is certainly something that we all know is a truism, Mr. Speaker, and anything that can increase access to dental care for those who wouldn't otherwise be able to access it, I think is a public good and is a benefit to certainly to those individuals, certainly to us in society, and ultimately to certainly the health outcomes, but also the public purse, Mr. Speaker. So we are happy to. I'm happy to see this change, and hope that it does lead to increased access for people of this province, and I specifically think of those living rurally and remotely. Mr. Speaker, this will, of course, provide more opportunities for patients and also more opportunities for hygienists and therapists. And Mr. Speaker, I understand that this does, in fact, bring Saskatchewan closer in line with other jurisdictions. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank those individuals in my constituency who raised this on the doorstep. As I noted, it was unusual to have this brought forward during the course of an election campaign so frequently. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I am prepared to conclude my remarks and move to adjourn debate on Bill number 61, the Dental Disciplines Amendment Act 2021.
You were speaking to Bill number 62, Dental Disciplines Amendment Act. Just
my apologies, Mr. Speaker. I move to adjourn debate on Bill 62. Pardon me. 61.
Just adjourn Bill 61. We'll move on to 62.
61. Pardon me, Mr. Speaker.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 24, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 62, the Dental Disciplines Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Saar.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to stand today to discuss Bill 62, the Dental Disciplines Amendment Act 2021. And I want to just very, very briefly respond to a couple of the comments from the Minister for Remote and Rural Health as he presented this bill. And I'm gonna do something that I don't usually do when I'm speaking to that minister, and I want to actually commend that minister for putting forth a very well-reasoned argument in presenting this bill. I did take time to review his comments, and I actually found his description to this bill to be a very well-reasoned approach to explaining why these changes are needed and who they will benefit, how it is designed to benefit folks to extend access to dental services. I will continue to listen to my colleagues as there is much in here describing the consultation that took place with Saskatchewan Dental Hygienists Association, Dental Assistants Association, and the Dental Therapists Association, as well as the College of Dentists and Surgeons and others in here. Obviously, important consultation. We want to see that the amendments that they suggested are certainly reflected here, and so to do that, I'll continue to listen to my colleagues as we debate this bill through adjourned debate. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 62, the Dental Disciplines Amendment Act 2021. Thank you.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In order to facilitate the work of committee this evening, I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Government House Leader has moved to adjourn the House. Is it pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. This House now stands adjourned till 1:30 tomorrow afternoon.